Welcome to the Historic Preservation Commission. This is Thursday, October 19th, 2017, and the time is 5:15. May we please have roll call?
Sure. Commissioner Craig Noddy.
Here.
Commissioner Shire.
Here.
Commissioner Vartanian.
Here.
Commissioner Morgan.
Here.
And Commissioner Doom.
Here.
And all 5 present.
Thank you. Item 2 on the agenda. The agenda for this meeting was posted on or before Monday, October 16th, 2017, on the bulletin board outside of City Hall. Agenda item number 3 is the approval of the meeting minutes from September 21st, 2017. Are there any comments or corrections? I have none.
None.
Is there
I
a
move
motion?
to approve them.
Second.
Commissioner Craig Noddy.
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan.
Yes.
Commissioner Vartanian.
Yes.
Commissioner Doom.
Yes.
Madam Chair Shire.
Yes.
Thank you.
Item 4 on the agenda is commission vote to fulfill the vice chair position.
And basically, when we made the transition for Vice Chair Shire to take the position after Commissioner Vidor left, we neglected to agendize a vice chair vote. So you can solicit nominations, and we'll take a vote.
Are there?
I nominate Commissioner Vartanian.
I second,
Thank you.
if you will accept it.
Do you accept?
I will accept.
Yay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do we need to close nominations at this point? Or?
We have to vote on it, right?
We need a vote. We have a motion, so we...
Yes, and a second.
And Morgan second.
Commissioner Craig Noddy.
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan.
Enthusiastically, yes.
Commissioner Doom.
Yes.
And Commissioner Vartanian, of course.
Yes, thank you.
Accept. Madam Chair Shire.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yay.
thank you.
Doesn't mean we're looking forward to you not being here. Just, you know.
Can make it happen. Okay, number 5 is oral communications. This is discussion limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is limited to 5 minutes, and the commission may question the speaker, but there will be no debate or decision. And so under this item, we've got one speaker, Sean Bursell.
Good afternoon, Chairman Shire and members of the Commission. My name is Sean Bursell, and I'm here speaking in 2 capacities this afternoon. First, as Executive Director of the Glendale Historical Society, I'm pleased to announce that with the support of the Glendale Historical Society, the Assistance League of Glendale last week nominated their headquarters building, the former Kiefer and Irick Mortuary, around the corner at 314 East Harvard Street, to the Glendale Register of the Historic Resources. And it was nominated under 2 criteria. One under Criterion 3 as an outstanding work of architecture and a work of a master architect, namely Alfred F. Priest. And then number 2, its association with somebody who is significant in Glendale's history, and that would be Alfred F. Priest. And it is, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It is a beautiful building. It is a masterful interpretation of the Tudor Revival style, and we look forward to this coming before the Commission for your consideration. And on that point, I would just like to ask that the Commission do whatever it can to move this nomination along expeditiously. It will be the 75th anniversary of the chartering of the Assistance League of Glendale in the spring of next year, and the Assistance League would greatly appreciate and welcome having their building designated by the time their 75th anniversary of chartering comes up in the spring. So my second thing, so I'm going to switch off, take off my TGHS badge, I'm going to put on my Casa Verdugo Historic District Committee hat and just update you on where we are with our Casa Verdugo, proposed Casa Verdugo Historic District, which you gave preliminary approval to, finding that it's preliminarily eligible to be a historic district. Back in August, you made that determination. We have been circulating petitions, and I'm pleased to tell you we're at 50%. And we're still soliciting more. As you know, at this level, at this stage of the historic district process, we need 25% of the homeowners. We're at 50%. We're continuing to work on that, and we will be submitting our petitions in the first week of November. So we look forward to that coming back to you in the near future. Thank you.
Congratulations.
If staff can add something for your petitions, you are now in sync with South Cumberland Heights. I've asked them to try to submit their petitions earlier, so that gives us enough time, because we don't know when the meeting's going to be in November. We have to cancel the November 16th meeting, and we'll probably be pushing it back, but since we're well over the threshold, we have to verify all those signatures and everything, so please submit tomorrow if you can, or as soon as you can.
Okay. We will submit as soon as we can. I mean, we obviously want to have as many signatures as possible going forward, but we will be cognizant of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great news.
Jay, quick question. Did you indicate then that South Cumberland also, they've reached probably their threshold?
They're at around 40%.
Okay.
And I've told them to, assuming I knew you guys were ahead of them, I thought. So, but at some point, keeping these two applications in sync may fall apart, but for now, it's going to make it easier for all of us to keep them there. So it's all appropriate.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, item 6, comments from commissioners. Do we have any today?
I don't.
Wow. Okay, I would like to just ask a question of Jay. Can I do that during oral communications?
I think so.
Okay, so we're looking at the South Glendale Historic Survey. It's going on right now. In 2004, the Cumberland Heights survey was done. Once that information is complete and the survey is adopted and everything, what resource is available for property owners, interested property owners, real estate agents, to, in the future, years down the road, determine the status of a property?
The city's website, I've said this too many times now for it to be believable, but our IS department has all of the information about all of the existing survey data that we have for all previous surveys, ready to roll. It's going to be attached to this thing called the property portal, which is on the city website, which is a resource to find out what zone you're in, a lot of information. There's going to be a big red word that says historic for anything that has been given a 5 or higher code, as well as a 6L code. And they just haven't, I don't actually know where it is right now. We're trying to reach out to them, but they're going through, they've got a lot of stuff on their end. So that's going to be the number one easy way to do it. Our staff, when someone comes into the counter, will have access to the property portal. It's also going to be an internal system we have called CSI. So they'll have access to the actual DPR forms that are attached to each property in the district. And so those will be the two main public ways.
And then, as it relates to the Glendale Historic Survey down in South Glendale, once those properties are surveyed and they're given their codes and everything, and let's say no historic districts are approved or even established down there beyond what's already there, what oversight or jurisdiction does historic preservation have on those properties, the 5 and the 6 properties?
Yeah,
and is it and actually, just sorry, really quickly, how does it differ from what they have in an actual historic district?
Yeah, for surveyed properties, CEQA applies to surveyed properties that are given a 5 code and higher. So those are considered historic resources, officially presumptive historic resources under CEQA, because they've been identified as such. So it does put people, just like the residents of the South Cumberland Heights area, their area has already been surveyed. So there is a level of historic review that's going on already for properties in that area. And that would be the case for any district or individual resource that's identified in the survey but isn't yet designated.
So then is there a difference between being in a historic district and then having your house?
That's
not?
an interesting question. It depends what rises to the level of review under CEQA, and we have to look to see if work proposed on a property would diminish its eligibility. For example, if a house has high integrity and someone proposes to replace the window replacement alone wouldn't diminish the integrity. we would try to work to make sure that the new windows were as close to the originals as possible, but we wouldn't be obligated to under CEQA if we could make the finding that that work wouldn't diminish its ongoing eligibility. Whereas in a historic district or an individual resource, we would say, no, you cannot replace those windows unless you replace them in a certain way.
Okay, thank you.
And Jay, I just wanted to thank you for the public meeting for South Cumberland and for Casa Verdugo. It was well attended, well presented, and well managed. It got a little challenging at some point, but
fun.
I think overall it was a really good meeting, and thank you for
Thanks.
taking care of that, as you always do. That's it.
Any other comments? Okay, we'll move to item 7 on the agenda. So today we have a special presentation honoring former Commissioner Arlene Vidor. So if I could ask you to come forward. We'd like to read something to you and share some sentiments and honor you today.
You're not going to make me cry, are you?
I'll try not to.
Okay.
We don't need tears. Okay, so we have a resolution of the Historic Preservation Commission. Whereas Arlene Vidor devoted 7.5 years of continuous service to the City of Glendale as a member of the Historic Preservation Commission from 2010 to 2017, serving diligently as Commission Chair for 2.5 years. And whereas Ms. Vidor's unselfish contribution of her personal time and energy and her knowledge of the city's history, neighborhoods, and buildings has promoted widespread respect for the objectives of the Commission and the City. Whereas Ms. Vidor has demonstrated strong and continuing interest in solving the many and varied problems before the Commission for the purpose of improving the welfare of the citizens through the protection of the city's heritage. And whereas Ms. Vidor has reinvigorated the city's effort to recognize important publicly owned buildings through the listing on the Glendale Register of Historic Resources and personally produced nominations for the Wallace House, Adams Square gas station, Miradero Gateway, and the Brand Family Cemetery. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Historic Preservation Commission and Community Development Department of the City of Glendale extend to Arlene Vidor sincere appreciation for the years of service so generously given. So we want to honor you with that.
Thank you very much.
We need a picture.
I wasn't planning a picture.
No, we do.
Oh, maybe not.
There we go. No, then people won't believe, this will not be a believable picture. You have to
Here, stand him here so we can all be. Get back there.
Yeah.
We can all be in front of our
Beautiful.
Everybody, everybody. Yeah.
There we go.
Just lean out. So
Oh, whoa, there's a soundtrack. There we go. And a closer shot. Okay, very nice.
Thank you so much.
You can stay for a second. We have a few comments for you.
Share a story.
Also, of course, having an Oscar acceptance speech.
Thank all the little people.
The music can swell if you get bored. Should I do my Oscar acceptance speech now?
However, you guys, do you want to?
Either way,
Go
Okay.
for it.
go ahead. We'll
All right,
comments.
all right. Well, my speech does not rise to the level of what you just said, so you'll have to forgive for that. But I, obviously would like to thank you so much and really thank you for the great amount of love that you've shown me here today. It's really overwhelming, and I really love you back. I appreciate this commission so much. And the historic preservation programs that have taken root and flourished in Glendale as a result of the work that you have all done, and I was proud to be a part of that, is really wonderful. It's an honor and a pleasure to have been part of this commission for 7.5 years. And Nick, congratulations on your appointment, and I hope you're enjoying yourself and you enjoy yourself as much as I did on the commission. Jay, you're the best. Just fantastic, and it's been really a pleasure to work with the entire staff, paid staff, paid interns, unpaid interns, whoever was here, always top quality, especially Armine Sukiazian and Deepaka now. Thank you for all the wonderful work you've done. And I love our debates. You know, that was one of the fun things about being on this commission. No matter where we were going, the discussion was always very thoughtful, very respectful. And even when we disagreed, I think the decisions that were made were all made very carefully. And even if we didn't have complete agreement, we made decisions that were in the best interest of the community. HPC, in my view, is a tight ship with a clear mission, and it has to make tough decisions, and I had and always will have confidence in that process. Now that I'm on the Arts and Culture Commission, whose mission is still evolving, a few things have become even more evident to me. There's a close relationship between a culturally and artistically rich city and the stewardship of its architectural heritage. We all know that, but it's really hit me in the face in the last few months. They're one and the same, and they have to be nurtured together. And this includes landmarks, undesignated treasures, neighborhoods, and the landmarks of the future, and I hope we're going to build some of those, too. I won't say any more about that. I'll quote from the Strategic Plan for the Arts, which was adopted by City Council in 1999 when the Arts and Culture Commission was formed. On the page that talks about zoning for the arts, it states, quote, "Preservation of historic resources anchors the community in its heritage through the artistry of architecture," unquote. So it's etched in stone. In the section on access to the arts, it states, quote, "A strong arts and culture plan should take into account the role of urban design, architecture, and landscape design," unquote. So I intend to stay involved in historic preservation, both as a former preservation commissioner and as an advocate for arts and architecture in my current role as an arts and culture commissioner. So you haven't seen the last of me. And in the words of our former governor and also movie star, I'll be back. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart. I really love you all.
Stay for a minute. We
Okay.
may have a few words for you.
All right.
Anyone wanna go?
You go ahead.
So I had nothing to do with writing that resolution, and I hadn't seen it before it was read, but every sentiment in there is exactly what I wanted to say to you. So
Obviously, somebody put the pen to the paper.
Even the whereases?
maybe not.
Natural.
Yeah.
But anyways, I so enjoyed being on this commission with you for so many years, and I know we'll still cross-sell with your new Arts and Culture Commission. Thank you for everything you brought to this commission, and we'll miss you.
Ditto.
We do.
Yeah, we do.
You and I came at the same time,
That's
very
right.
first one, and it's been sad not seeing you over there on the dais, but you're the best. I mean, truthfully the best. I know where your heart is. I've known you for long before. I could do the crying thing.
Right, yeah.
But
Well, each of you, you know, it's so great is you've got four here. Just very, I don't know you well, Nick, but I'll be back, like I said, so I will. But, you know, really distinct personalities with complementary viewpoints and interests, and that makes for such a wonderful commission. And, you know, with the give and take and it's kind of a tension. I mean, I don't mean that in the literal sense, but, you know, with the Historical Society and the commission and the staff. I mean, historic preservation is an amazing function in Glendale, and I can remember when there wasn't anything. And, you know, there are a lot of people in the room right now. Not a lot of people. There are a few people in the room right now who did quite a bit for historic preservation. And, you know, on the Arts and Culture Commission, if we can do the same thing for the arts, we'll be in good shape. And I hope that, you know, as I continue to stay involved, you don't end up. There's a great song by, I don't know if you know Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks. It's one of my favorite music groups. He has a song, "How Can I Miss You When You Won't Go Away?" So you may find yourself singing that song. Anyway, thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You were a great steward for my first year, so thank you for that. And the city of Glendale
Pleasure.
thanks you for all of your service, of course, and continued service.
Yeah, thank you. All right.
And thank you, Arlene. It was always a pleasure
Last
working
one,
with you.
maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe
I
not.
appreciated the dialogue,
Well,
your very
also-
thoughtful insights, and the time and effort you spent, and obviously bringing nominations before us.
Yeah.
It's a lot of effort, so we really appreciate
Even the ones we were supposed to do.
It
Yes,
was
I think
fun.
you picked up Lorna's and my nomination, so
Thank you.
Not off the hook.
That's right. I stole your gates right out from under you. Anyway, yeah, at times it seemed like the Supreme Court, it was so intense. Well, maybe not that intense. Anyway, thank you all.
Staff
very-
enjoyed your presence here too, and so we're glad you'll be around.
Oh.
And it's fitting tonight that we're looking at two of the nominations you
Yes,
brought
and
us. So.
I submitted a card, so.
Oh,
you
perfect.
can-
She's really going
I'm
to
gonna
gonna be
fight
back
for-
very
I'm going to
soon.
fight for it. Okay, thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Mwah.
thank you.
Is that the first blown kiss we've had?
Oh, yes. We should replay that over and over. We may need a few kisses. Okay,
Big
item.
blow up.
Yeah. We move on to item 8 on the agenda, old business, and 8A is 1450 Royal Boulevard, a Glendale Register nomination and a Mills Act application, including consideration of request for a Mills Act petition. Sorry about that. Including the including the consideration of a request for a Mills Act condition applied by the commission, and this is actually a continued agenda item from the HPC hearing, September 29th, 2016.
So this is a unusual situation for us. Continuations are made at public hearings when the commission feels there isn't enough information to make a decision or would like to provide the applicant with the opportunity to bring more information to make their case. And three of the five commissioners were present at that hearing. I have been told that our new commissioners, Cargnati and Doom, have both reviewed the tape and looked at the staff report for this item. Because tonight you're going to be, the applicant, Roxanne Odom, is asking that you reconsider a condition that you were thinking to impose on the Mills Act contract as part of any approval for the Glendale Register. And if you're inclined to do that, and I'm not sure what direction this is kind of, we're kind of treading or breaking new turf here. So ultimately, I think the best thing to do would be to allow Roxanne Odom to present to the commission. She has some people testifying on her behalf. Her argument is in a nutshell, is that she would prefer to move forward with the nomination either without this condition or with, I'm not sure if there are any revisions proposed. And at that point, the commission can then discuss whether or not to move forward with the recommendation. And as you know, all of your decisions for Glendale Register are recommendations to City Council. So even if you recommend denial, Ms. Odom could bring her application to Council, and depending on the discussion tonight and your final decision, it could still have another chance to be heard. So this wouldn't necessarily be the final stop. So that's all I think I have to say. We have the staff report from last year, from September of last year. You also have in your package a report from Historic Resources Group, who was retained by the applicant to consider the eligibility of the house and the impacts of the pool. And I should say, as you know, the issue is the hardscape, landscaping, and the design of the pool at the rear of the house gave I believe all of the commissioners some pause at the last hearing, and that's the kind of crux of this discussion.
Do you have the photos to just show to the
Yes,
public
yes.
as far as before we start?
We have an overview photo taken from the rear yard is terraced, as you can see in the right-hand photo. We have a view from that terrace down to the rear yard, and then from the house side toward the pool. And if I remember correctly, the commission's concerns were largely about the amount of hardscape, the amount of concrete work at the back, the design of the pool, particularly some of the tile designs, and then some of just the amount of kind of blank wall. I can read to you, if I find it, from my staff notes at the hearing, just to refresh the commission's memory. When you voted to continue this, you gave the applicant guidance without being specific, because the idea was that she was then going to work with a landscape designer or present some new ideas to the commission. The idea was that the new work would soften the appearance of the rear yard, that the work would be revised to be a little more in keeping with the Spanish colonial style of the house, to bring a high level of design to the rear work, and then, as I said, this would apply to the pool, the landscape, the hardscape, and then there was also mention made of just materials in general. So those were the key issues identified by the commission.
Okay. So with that, we'll open up the public hearing. Roxanne Odom.
Thank you. First off, when Jay came over to the house, one thing I discussed with him was, before we even engaged in putting the pool in, I went to his presentation at the old Sealy factory. And while I was at that event, I asked him, long before we put the pool in, does it matter? Because we were going to apply for the historic designation. And my recollection, and Jay, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was it didn't matter a whole lot. So we went ahead and we put the pool in. We engaged Scott, our neighbor next door, to be our designer, and had the pool put in. Since the last meeting, I've worked with Scott a bit to try and soften things up, as you had all suggested. We put in some more plants. We are going to purchase some pots, but again, I didn't have much direction on what kind of pots, so we've looked at all sorts of pots, and I'm happy to add. We're going to put in fruit trees in the pots, probably a lime, a lemon, blood orange, among other things, and soften it up even a bit more than it is now. Again, we put in more plants. Jay didn't feel when he was out that there was anything we can do to eliminate the concrete, because I know the way the photos look, it looks like there's more space than there actually is, but there really isn't that much space, which was one of Jay's comments when he came out, that cutting into it, I think, would not be good. And I think, actually, for me, it's best if I defer to Scott. He can tell you the decisions made that I can't speak to. There were design choices that he chose to do because of issues in the yard with the level of the, I don't even know what the term is, concrete, or not concrete, the soil. And that's why the lip along the pool, and we did it for seating and also, honestly, enjoyment of the yard. I think with that said, I think it's best to bring Scott on up here, unless you have any questions for me.
That's fine. We'll move on to.
But you did consult with staff, right, with Jay after the?
Yeah, he came out to the house. Mm-hmm.
Well, just to be clear, we did, I'm sure, talk at Sealy's, and I probably said, yeah, you can put pools into historic houses. We didn't talk about anything specific. I never reviewed the design of the existing pool, but we did, after the hearing, I did go out and meet with Roxanne, and she's correct that when we were walking in this area, where the hardscape is, it was hard to see areas where you could pull out significant amounts of concrete to really do landscaping. So we did talk primarily about landscaping of these terraced areas, how to soften those areas. We also did talk about possible redesigns for the tile areas and how to bring that to be more in the traditional style. We talked about planters with fruit trees as an option, or with any kind of landscape as an option instead of cutting concrete, since it seemed those would be probably more realistic to fit in there. The other thing I forgot to mention is that there's no staff report for this, because staff stands behind the previous recommendation for approval, but the commission is in full, I believe everyone here knows, but I just want to put it out there, the commission has full jurisdiction over any Mills Act conditions, and those will just be relayed directly to council, regardless of whether you decide to approve this or to deny it. So.
Okay. Did you have a question?
Yes, may I ask, how long did you own the house before you installed the pool?
We moved in, let's see, when my son was 2 weeks before my son was born. So we've lived there 15 years, and then we put the pool in 2015. Yeah.
So you moved in 2000, built a pool in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do to the backyard in those 15 years?
That was honestly the biggest downer when we purchased this home. You weren't here, but you know the story, but we wrote the homeowner, we drive by this house and we love the house, and we wrote the homeowners a note that lived there, if you ever sell, to contact us. Well, the neighbor next door contacted us when they decided to sell. And we just loved the house, looking at it from the street. So then when we went to go look at it, and then we went to the backyard, we thought, oh, it was terraced with basically just rose bushes and weeds in the backyard. And then the patio was nice. It had the terracotta tile and planters, but the backyard was nothing. There was really no usable space whatsoever, and we've got 2 kids.
Is that back wall with the diamonds on it any part of the remaining part of the terrace, or is that all new too?
Yeah, no, the upper one was there, and yeah, there were, I can't honestly remember the number of steps going down, but there were a few.
Okay. So that is the existing terrace, one of them there?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
all right. Thank you.
Are you asking, is it existing retaining wall or terracing in, like,
Where I see the
earth?
plants, she installed plants. I guess rose bushes or weeds were there before, but that's an existing wall.
Yeah, I think it may have stuck out or went back in. I honestly can't remember, but there were multiple layers, a couple of them.
This upper wall was existing as a
Yeah.
retaining
Right.
wall. And then there were subsequent lower retaining walls.
Uh-huh.
Probably not right in this location. I can't say for sure. We
Yeah.
did look at an aerial view that showed the house before the pool was installed, and there were a couple of steps coming down.
So if it was terraced, how much space, if I'm looking at the top picture towards the front of the pool, how much space was open before the terrace started?
You know, honestly, I don't recall much. I mean, it was.
Was it similar where it is, where the pool starts?
The next speaker might be able to address
Oh,
that.
Exactly.
Maybe. The one that designed it, he might.
Well, you were there.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
When space was there.
She
You
doesn't
had
know what
kids.
it is.
I know at the back of the house, which is where the jacuzzi is.
Uh-huh.
Again, it was a little wall with
Okay,
more,
so it started there. All right,
more
just
roses.
functionality of the backyard. I'm trying to picture what it.
It wasn't functional.
Because in the video before I watched it, it was just there and gone. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I'd like to call Scott Smith.
Sorry, I was going to help rescue her there for a second. To answer your question.
And your name?
There are 3 things that cause the pool to be designed in the manner in which it is right now. Oh, sorry. My name is Scott Smithson, and I'm an architectural designer and interior designer, and I designed the pool in the backyard for the Odoms. So the conditions in the yard were as, if you look in the upper picture on the far left where the stairs come down, there's a white post holding up the breezeway roof line. From that point all the way across the backyard was a 4.5-foot wide concrete walkway. And that goes all the way across to where you see the seating area on the right. Then there was an 18-inch step up to a flat pad that went basically almost to the existing back wall where the diamonds are right there. It was slightly terraced, but on a low grade, but mostly level, and it was just bad lawn. That's all that was there. When we did the soils report in advance of digging and contracting for the pool, we went through the expense of having a soils report done. We found that the soils conditions, if we went deeper into the ground, the pool is only 5.5 feet deep. So if we went deeper into the ground, we got into substrate where we could not support the pool, and it would probably have required anywhere from 2 to 10 casings to support the weight of the pool. So when we looked at what we had available in which to be able to put the pool in safely and from an engineering standpoint, we realized that we needed to raise the level of the pool up so that we didn't go so deeply down into the ground. So literally we went from a grade like this that was probably maybe an 18-inch drop over 20 feet to being 18 inches up to the face of the pool at the 15-foot mark, which is what the front edge of the pool is. Then the jacuzzi sticks out beyond that. Between the jacuzzi and the house is only 12 feet. So they're really, in this, it may look considerably bigger than it does. It does step back, and if you look in this photograph here that we will submit today, which is this photograph here, that's the view from the back of the house looking forward, and you can see that the landscaping is filling in and starting to soften up on the back wall. We have Japanese maples in there, kangaroo palm, lots of lantana, and several other drought-resistant things that'll fill in over the year, along with several creeping figs to make that second retaining wall not so bright white. Now, the other problem that we have, if you notice to the left side of that staircase to the guest house above the garage, the entire garage is below the grade of the backyard. So when you go from the actual flat level of the backyard that you see there, it steps down into the garage, and there is a massive retaining wall holding up the back wall of the garage. So any planters up against that back side would be, detrimental to the foundation in the back side of the garage. We already had issues in the past with some moisture and some foxing of the interior plaster of the garage. So we decided that we wanted to be able to take the pool deck all the way to the face of the garage. We thought that possibly like that indented area there where the Chase Lounge is showing, and in this application here where you see the umbrella, we thought about putting in a planter in there and keeping it there, but it just would have created a moisture issue and a possible drainage issue up against the foundation of the garage and caused the garage to leak. So we decided that that was just not a wise decision for long-term safety of the house. So the backyard is heavily drainage. There are 2 drains in that upper terrace on that side, 2 on this side, and 4 across the back of the house. Considering that we only have 12 feet from the face of the jacuzzi to the back wall of the house, there's barely any room to put a decent set of tables and chairs in that location to entertain in. So making that smaller to put in a planter, we either put it against the face of the pool and you're flush up against the house, or you put it against the house and we have the same issue again of putting planters and things. So we would rather do it with movable pots and such in that regard. Now, as far as the step is concerned and the broadness of the steps, we did a rectangular pool so that we could have an automatic pool cover over it that could be locked because she does have children. So we want to be able to keep that as a safety, and it also helps keeps the pool cleaner and helps retain warmth. As far as the height of the step is only 2 steps, so that the deck, the perimeter deck at its highest point is basically 18 inches, which is chair height. So it allows it to be additional seatings for when you are entertaining. You could actually tuck a table into one of the corners and use one side of the jacuzzi and one side of the pool deck as bench and be able to actually entertain in that situation like that. Now, as far as the materials are on the pool, that back wall with the diamonds on it is approximately 55 feet across, and that's 55 feet of Cal Pottery Malibu tile all the way across that. Even though it shows white, it's actually a soft creamy yellow-white in color. All of the tile on the back of the house is all Malibu tile, which would be perfectly in keeping with the house in the era of which it was done. It was all custom colored specifically by us. We went through their entire color palette and picked every one of the tiles and put it in there so that we could do it. The spouts in the diamonds on the back wall are handmade wrought iron that were done in Arizona, and they're specific so that they will not dribble back on the wall. So they actually drop. There's about a 2-inch drop on them. So as the water pours out of them, you don't get any blowback onto the pool deck that would create any additional wear and tear. Now, as far as the retaining wall, there is a new retaining wall in front of the existing retaining wall, which is what you see there with the tile on it, and that was just done as a concern. It's literally there's one, and then there's a second one in front of it because it also becomes part of the bond beam for the backside of the pool. So as an engineering standpoint, that's why it's there. So it's a double thick wall at that point to help the larger wall, which is back to the property line. The upper terrace is wrapped in iron work tile that we pulled out of several different reference points, and we used a sand finish, concrete finish on all of the pool deck so that it would look old and it would have a slightly mottled effect. It isn't a smooth surface. It looks like it's already had years and years of wear on it. So we've done our best to try to age the pool for being a modern pool, but you can't have certain things and still get your pool cover and things like that, so you end up with those cantilevered edges, which are the only really super contemporary thing about the pool. So that's about all I have for myself. I can submit these photos for you guys to pass around. There's 2 different views there. And if you have any other questions, now that I've rambled on for several moments.
Yes. The top part up here.
The upper terrace, yes.
Upper terrace. How wide is that?
About 11 feet.
11 feet wide.
Hmm. And there's actually a second, well, you can see that there's there's a second retaining wall that holds the pool up from the house above that's behind that. That's the one that's in the back behind the wrought iron.
And that was existing?
That's all existing. That's the way they bought the house. There's also a secondary access exit from up there. You can go out. In that photograph there, if you travel towards the guest house, there is a locked gate there, and there is a pathway from there out to the Moreno Avenue off-ramp, side street.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, we've got more speaker cards.
Just a quick question. So on the retaining walls, which were apparently pre-existing?
Yes.
What materials were?
There's cinder block underneath. And at one point, they tried to do a ruin wall effect, so there were some half clay brick sort of cemented in to make it look like it was aging, and it was just very unattractive as a whole. It was a bad thought that didn't go very far, and it didn't look very good. So when we decided if we were going to clean this up, we were going to clean it up to match all the existing stucco around the perimeter of the house, and then had the whole house and all the stucco painted to match in color.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, next is Greg Grammer.
Good evening, Chair Shire, members of the Historic Preservation Commission, city staff. My name is Greg Grammer. I'm the president of the Glendale Historical Society. And on behalf of the organization and its board of directors, I would like to express our strong support for the application to designate 1450 Royal Boulevard, known as Tupper House, as a historic resource on the Glendale Register. Tupper House is one of Glendale's finest examples of Spanish colonial revival residential architecture, and it is incredibly well preserved and remarkably intact. We agree with the staff recommendation and concur with HRG's professional assessment that the pool and landscape improvements in the backyard do not affect any significant character-defining features and in no way impact the property's architectural integrity and eligibility for local listing. Again, we encourage the Commission to recommend approval of the Glendale Register application and Mills Act contract for the property at 1450 Royal Boulevard. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, John Lacascio.
Thank you, Chair Shire. My name is John Lacascio. I'm a historic architect. I work with Historic Resources Group in Pasadena. You have our assessment of 1450 Royal. I don't have a formal presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. I will briefly summarize that we determined that the property is eligible for the Glendale Register as an excellent, and we would go so far as to say, one of the finest examples of Spanish colonial revival architecture in the city. As you know, we've seen a lot of the houses in the city. This stands out. This is one of the best. It is exceptional in every way. And it has a remarkably high degree of integrity. It is almost completely untouched. Certainly the exterior is virtually untouched, and there's only minor alterations on the interior. The bulk of the landscape in the front and along Moreno Drive is, we don't know what the historic landscape was. We have one fuzzy aerial photo from, I believe, 1943, but it's consistent in terms of content, grass and shrubs. Obviously, we don't know if these are the original grass and shrubs, but it doesn't really matter. It's the setting that matters. The pool did not alter or destroy any character-defining features of the house or of the property. It was an empty hillside, as far as we can tell. In that 1943 photo, it looks like there's nothing there. My suspicion is that backyard was a service yard. The only rooms that opened onto it were the kitchen, the laundry room. I'm sure there was a laundry line for hanging laundry. Maybe there was a victory garden during the war, as everyone had. But it was not, the main exterior space were those lawns on Moreno and Royal, and then the courtyard, the patio, which was, as we know from the Tupper's granddaughter's accounts, that was the main living space of the house. So the pool did not alter any of that. The pool, that has always been open space. It's still open space. It's just a pool, and it's terraced. Did not affect the integrity of the property at all. It altered the setting slightly, but did not destroy it, and that's the key. The house itself, and it's being nominated for architecture, it is intact. It has a very, very high degree of integrity, and it is one of the finest in the city. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, I will leave you there.
I have none at this time.
I had just a question for some clarity on your report. The sentence on the first page versus the 14th page, I need some clarity. First page says did not alter or destroy. On page 14 it says has slightly altered but not destroyed. What do you stand by?
It has slightly altered because it is a change, but not a destruction of setting. I mean, you could essentially pave the whole property, but the architecture of the house would remain intact. Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay. With that, we'll close the public hearing and take discussion among commissioners.
I have a question for Mike and Lorna, the three of you.
Sure.
Did you visit the property before?
Yes.
When you walk through, is it, as they say, everything inside looks pretty much good? And
No,
outside?
it's exemplary. I don't think the problem ever was that it shouldn't be on the Glendale Register. It has to do with the Mills Act, and that's our problem.
Well,
Okay.
if I could answer, we don't consider the interior, right? We only consider the exterior of the house, every facade and setting and landscape, so front and backyard, so the entire property. Interior, we don't have purview over, so
Okay.
whether that is intact or not, unfortunately, we can't
Oh.
weigh in on that.
All right.
So to answer your question, yes, I personally toured, as I think many of the other commissioners did. And if you can you back to the front slide, the side of the front of the house? If you look at the front of the house, beautiful, intact, Spanish colonial style. You flip to the backyard photos, and quite honestly, in my opinion, I would say that it would be a different house. So it's just the style, the level of integrity from the front, and maybe even size of the house, and even the side courtyard they're talking about, which was beautiful with a little beehive fireplace and courtyard. And the finishes used in those areas are very much in keeping with the original character, style, integrity is there. As you move towards the back of the property, in my opinion, the character, style, finishes, material, workmanship, all that diminishes. So the photos are pretty much exactly what we did see a year ago. I haven't seen the property since.
When you say it diminishes, if the pool wasn't there and the backyard looked like she described it when they moved in, what would you think of the property then, the backyard then? If it was full of weeds and roses and terrace and looked like that?
Well, we can put conditions on, registered properties that have Mills Act. So we could do a condition to put in some gardens or update the landscaping or, if it needed to be cleaned up because it truly was the backyard of weeds, obviously we could put a similar condition. I think the challenge here is if that pool or design came to us today, I personally would not have approved it. I think it doesn't, you look at most Spanish colonial homes at this scale and level of home with the integrity in the front yard, architectural features, landscaping, all that. And usually there is a high integrity between the gardens, outdoor spaces, and interior, meaning the architecture. And so for me, when I say it diminishes, as you walk around the house, it doesn't look and feel like the front, like that Spanish character continued into the backyard, pool, hardscape, lack of landscape, all of that. So I don't know if you've toured many of the other Spanish colonial homes, but there are some beautiful terrace properties with gardens, fruit trees, fountains that would be much more in keeping with the Spanish colonial style, which I think we're losing here. So I think it was a lost opportunity when they redid it by the choice of design and selection, in my opinion.
Okay.
And again, Nick, to speak to your question, I don't think it's just about the pool. It's the redesign of the entire backyard. So everything we're seeing, the terracing, the materials that were used, the way it's been laid out. I think, so we've determined that this is considered a change, and it is, but for changes on properties, we usually look for compatibility. And I think the commission felt that this design was not compatible with the overall integrity and design of the house itself. In other words, it doesn't appear to pay homage to to the distinctive character of the house itself. So the commission felt there was too much concrete, too much hardscape, too many sharp corners. Again, I think different, as was proposed before, different materials could probably have been utilized, more permeable materials. What is that, decomposed granite? Pebbles, grass, more plantings. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a blank slate, apparently. It was a blank slate. And again, I think the owners have created what works for them. You know, this is the backyard that works for them, and this is the design they wanted. And so they should be able to enjoy their backyard. But if we determine that we don't consider this design for the entire backside of the property to be compatible, or if there is a way that it can be softened or changed to become more compatible. I mean, that design review is under our purview.
Okay. As I read through this giant book, a little more each day, my understanding of the Mills Act, it's the exterior of the house and the property. Since we look at historical locations, how much of the property outside, not touching the house, can be changed suitable with the times? If this, hypothetically, and this is all learning curve for me too, if this pool was curved, would that be a big difference?
Jay, do you want to answer that for him?
Yeah, you know, there, in any design review, historic or not, there are an infinite number of solutions to any given problem. Unless a landscape feature is identified as a character-defining feature at the time a house is designated, obviously this one's not designated yet, but it is a contributor in the district, we only regulate landscape features that are identified as historically important. Meaning, technically, someone could come to us and change out 100% of their exterior landscaping. We'd review that and try to make sure that whatever they're proposing is consistent with the style in the neighborhood.
So the pool had been built in the 1950s, and it was 60 years old. If a pool was installed in the 1950s to this property and it was 60 years old, would that matter? It was an older pool?
It's not really the age, it's really the
appearance?
the design. And yeah.
Yeah. Pretty much with design review, everything's case by case because we can't say there's a blanket pool that's acceptable for one type or another.
Does our city have any Mills Act properties with pools?
Oh yeah.
Oh, many.
Many of them.
And
And
they're
many that have been done later, and many that have been done very well, and in keeping with the architectural style and integrity of the house, and using materials, finishes, styles that celebrate the actual style rather than maybe
contrast with.
contrast.
Okay.
Other commissioners, comments?
Well, my biggest thing is just there is not a lot more that can be done. I mean, you pretty much defined everything that can be done on in the back area, correct? And the staff is happy with that?
Well, staff hasn't had the opportunity to review any of the new changes. I believe it's just planting changes. I don't think any other changes have been made since I went to the site quite a while ago.
To be fair, staff was fine with it the way it was.
So, yeah, I was just going to say, staff was originally fine with it. To confess, this is one of the few sites that I did not visit before the staff report was presented to the commission. But I did see the photos and didn't jump out at me. But that really doesn't matter. Mills Act conditions, you know, staff may recommend some conditions for obvious things, and we've also taken the lead from the commission. We now look much more carefully at garage doors than we used to look at a number of years ago. We look more carefully at other changes. And just as we do with the design review board, we learn from the decisions that the commission here makes And in this case, this didn't jump out at me. And I do think the house is quite an amazing specimen. But I hear the issue. It's a contributing structure in a historic district on a corner lot, so a lot of the house is already regulated through the listing as a contributor in the district, and it's completely within the commission's purview to make Mills Act recommendations. And as I mentioned before, if the commission is uncomfortable approving the house, that's only a recommendation to council, and council could hear the same arguments and feel that maybe the commission, or just disagree with the commission, and the house could still be designated. So I leave you with this, on committal response.
So just to be clear, a year ago, we sent the owner away to reevaluate, knowing our concerns, and to come back with, I thought it was a suggestion, solution, improvements to the backyard. What I hear today is more just justification for why they haven't done anything in a year, and they want to just try to approve it as is. Is that my?
I believe
correctly?
that's more or less the case. Okay. When I met with the applicant, I did agree. The physical space once you're between the pool and the house is rather tight, and is tighter than it looks like in this photo. It was hard for me to see where we would start cutting that concrete to kind of put planters in. And that's where the suggestion came up. Let's look into planters. Let's look into other more movable options to kind of soften that area. We did talk specifically about changing the plantings around the perimeter. It sounds like they have done some of that. But we did also talk about some of the tile work, because my memory is that the commission was also not happy with the Spanish colonial character of the tile as it was laid, regardless of whether the tiles themselves are appropriate. I think it was the overall design. So we did talk about the possibility that would need to be redesigned.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry, but we don't have any new photos of any improvements since last year.
Yeah,
only what were submitted tonight.
Which the same besides plants have grown a little.
I haven't even seen those photos, but as best I can tell.
Yeah.
And that patio area is just basically poured concrete. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and then it's finished.
So, at a minimum, in line with what we were sort of envisioning and asking for, that could have been a more permeable surface.
That's true. It could be.
And I think that in and of itself would have made a difference.
Yeah. To be fair, decomposed granite and gravel in that kind of location are not really a livable kind of solution in terms of walking on it or tracking dirt. But I did expect, before coming back to the commission, I thought we would have some drawings showing what a new proposal was going to be. And that's the difference between what you're hearing tonight versus what I think we were expecting after the last hearing.
Right. I would have to, yes, I think we were expecting to see some drawings and something we could work with. The owner did say to us at the last minute that they were willing to meet with a designer and create a yard more in tune with the house. The owner also said verbatim, "We do hate all the concrete because it's too much concrete." I rewatched the hearing 3 times to make sure I didn't miss anything. So I just feel like we're not, we expected something different today than what we're hearing or seeing, and the only reason we didn't deny it at the last hearing was so that we could have some changes brought back to us, trying to create an environment in the backyard that was more in tune with the house. And at a different level for me personally, I'm a little hesitant to set a precedent that sort of sends a message that one can do work on a very grand scale on their property shortly before designating without going through our historic preservation department for consultation. I'm a little concerned about that. And
yes, it's true. In a district setting, because the pool is completely non-visible from any street. We did no historic review per the Historic District Ordinance.
Right.
It went to design review?
It went through, it was a staff level exemption, which means that staff checks zoning, staff should have checked landscape coverage issues because of all the decking, but there's no real design review for pools unless we can, generally you can't see a pool, but you might see pool structures or trellises or something, but here there was nothing.
Can I speak?
Sure.
Okay. So, as a point of clarity, I was actually on the commission when this house was before us last year, and I toured the property at the time last year. I was not able to make the meeting. Unfortunately, there was a schedule change or something. And at the time, I agreed with staff's assessment, and I still agree with it today. I don't think this pool is any kind of a detriment to the architectural integrity of this house. I was very kind of confused when I went back and watched the hearing. I've been in a lot. I've been on the property of a lot of homes like this, and so I'm a little bit concerned about the comments regarding the integrity of the architecture and whatnot on the back of the house. Many of these homes were built with all of the embellishment and all of the money spent on the fronts of these homes and in the formal spaces of these homes. And the backs of these homes are generally not all that exciting. They're very flat, very common, just like this. And when you look at the architecture, if you just block the patio and look at the house, it's perfectly intact. You can walk around 360 degrees of this house, and it is impeccably intact. We have a lot of Spanish revivals on our list. This one is one style in particular, one design in particular that I don't think I've ever seen. And that we're getting hung up on this pool. I can point to 2 properties that are on the register, and I'm sorry to call precedent, that have pools that not only don't really enhance the architecture of the house to which they belong, but they are in stark contrast, to use another word, in terms of time and space and everything. And so that we're getting hung up on a pool and a design that is quite lovely. I don't know what the commission would have recommended for this space, aside from planting and landscaping, and we have to be very careful when we regulate landscaping, because it's not the architectural feature of this house. We every time something comes before us, and we have to consider the meeting of old versus new, I think of the parachute company that we nominated, that we approved last year, that got approved last year, that was this great old brick building. Was great. And then on the back of it was this absurdly modern, all-glass structure that in absolutely no way enhanced the architecture of that structure. But we approved it because it was done in such a way that you could see through it and you could still see the architecture of this building inside that was still there. The same goes for here. You can stand, just from this picture, you can see that the architecture is fully intact on this house. So that we're nitpicking about the pool is really, really frustrating, and I think that they've done a beautiful job. This pool could have been so completely different and much more stark and much more distracting and much different than it was. They at least tried, and in my opinion probably didn't really need to, and we have to be careful when we ask them to, tried to at least work with materials and styles and tiling and things like that of the era. It's not supposed to look like it. It's supposed to look different. New things are supposed to look different from the old so that we can see the old versus the new. So that we're getting hung up on this because there's a lot of concrete in the back. It's not about the backyard. It's about the house. It's about the architecture of the house. I don't think the architect really thought a lot about the backyard. If you looked at it before, or from the verbal description, there was very little care given to it except to keep the dirt back so it didn't fall on the house. It's about the architecture of the house, and I'm just really frustrated, and I feel really badly that this homeowner had to go this whole year waiting for this, and I was frustrated that I couldn't be at the meeting to voice my opinions then, because this is such an amazing piece of property and a beautiful house, and it's a beautiful pool. It's a wonderful pool that, yes, anybody would be excited to enjoy, and I don't think in any way that it takes away from the integrity of the house.
Thank you. Jay, would you mind addressing some of the architectural and additions or modifications, and also addressing that it's not just the house, it's the entire property, just for a little clarity for the public?
Yeah, the difference between the Glendale Register and a contributing building in a historic district is that we look at the ensemble, as they say in New Orleans. We look at the whole thing. We look at the perimeter walls, we look at the landscaping, we look at the hardscaping, we identify any landscape features that are important. So we're doing the full 360 review, and it is within the Commission's purview for any Glendale Register nomination to consider aspects that are invisible from the street. It's also, you know my opinion on this, so I'm just seeing both sides here. But in terms of purview over landscaping, when we think about, the Design Review Board and design rules are very similar to what we do with the Historic Preservation Commission. This is kind of outside of design review because we're talking about something that's already done. But in general, the Design Review Board has the purview to review down to the species of plants, what is planted on a site, the arrangement of those plantings, whether they're sympathetic to the traditional versus modern design, for example. And the landscape that's approved by the board is expected to remain in place for 5 years after the approval, acknowledging that landscape changes over time and all that. So all I can say is I'm hearing I hear all sides of this story, but in terms of a Mills Act condition, regardless of whether the pool is, and I can also address the idea of whether this is differentiated from the historic character. Standard 9 of the Secretary's Standard says that things shall be compatible yet differentiated. What is the hardest thing for any designer, any preservationist, any board member, any member of the public to do? Interpret that. There are a million ways to interpret that, and you can err on the side of being more traditional, and I would still look at this if this had more traditional tile work, and I'd say, well, yeah, a raised pool like this is not something that was built in 1920, whatever this house was. And that alone would make it distinctive and distinguishable from the early construction. The question I think the Commission was struggling with was the compatibility issue, whether this design is compatible with this house. And I think that's, as I said, the crux of your dilemma tonight.
I think sorry, really quick, just to respond to that last statement. Different yet compatible. That is just so vague and subjective.
Purposefully
and
so.
Very difficult. Very difficult to marry.
Yes.
Different and compatible. Seems very, the two actually, I think those are not even
going back
synonyms.
To Justice
frankly.
Stewart or whoever, the classic, how do you define pornography? You define compatibility the same way.
Justice Stewart, very good.
Oh, right. History guy.
History buff.
Sorry.
No, so I was going to say, we do have a house on the register which has a very contemporary pool in the backyard. That would be Funk House. But I think that pool, though it's contemporary, it's in an overall setting where it is not the focal point of the property. It's almost like an accessory or a sculpture that you view. And so the setting of the property overall has much more greenery, changes in permeable hardscaping, distinctions moving from one area to the next. It also has views. For me, when I walked into this backyard, I just felt like I walked into a very stark interior space, just that was like walls of concrete. I hate to put it that way, I'm so sorry, but that's just my honest opinion of moving into this space. And that's where I don't think this type of articulation with this much use of these types of materials could have even been envisioned when the house was built.
If I could just refer to the HRG report for a minute. In the historic integrity, which I think is what we're talking about, historic integrity of this property, and again, we got to get away from just saying house because it's the property. It's property line to property line. It's the entire property that we're considering. There are many things to consider. One is it says design, so that's all elements, form, plan, space, structure, style. It's setting, the physical environment of the historic property. It's the materials that are used. It's the feeling, a property's expression of the aesthetic or historic sense of a period in time. And I think when you have to look at those words, that's exactly what we're talking about as a compatibility. Jay, if you could again go back to the front of the house. If you flip between front of the house, back of the house, front of the house, back of the house. It's, in my opinion, there's not a lot of congruity or compatibility in style. And I think that's where some of us are having a struggle with. It's not just the pool, it's that entire setting, that aesthetic, the feeling, the expression, what we're really saying that if we're nominating this for an exemplary example, the best of its class in all of Glendale, and you have to look from property line to property line, I have to say this backyard is not one of the best that speaks to the original integrity of the architectural style. It absolutely does not. And so that's where I'm stuck. And I love the fact that it's in a historic neighborhood. It's a contributing structure. We've got all the protections necessary to preserve this house. So I think the city, we're being the best stewards of the city's property, saying it's covered. It's going to be protected. And the owners at the same point can love the design they chose and can enjoy their backyard without any worry that anything will happen to this property.
I'm intimately aware and familiar with the Funk House, and
It's not called the Funk House, it's the Jacob B. Funk
sorry,
House.
well, we've shortened it. I'll tell you, we've abbreviated
I call it
that
the Funk
slightly.
House.
The Jacob B. Funk House. That pool, I will tell you, does not speak at all to the architecture of the house. It doesn't even really complement it. It's completely different. It's in a similar location off the kitchen like this one is. You can look at the back of this house and see that really none of the public space is really in the back of that house. It really isn't a feature of the house that was an area of the house when the house was originally built that I think was intended to be a focal point. I mean, look at the way the house is designed. There's no focal point access from there. I believe that's the kitchen. Yeah. And so you're right, in 1920, whatever, when this house was built, this was probably not envisioned. Pools were not a thing, really. The technology probably wasn't there, maybe slightly there to do the retaining walls. We don't know when those retaining walls were built. There's only so much you can kind of do, unfortunately, in a space like this. What the public can't see are the photographs that we looked at that show that the landscaping has grown in significantly in the year, and in my opinion has softened up even better, obviously, than the pictures that they see on the screen. All that stuff is twice as tall now and very thick and lush. I don't know. I'm really almost constantly confused by the different but compatible thing that we face all the time. The Funk House is a perfect example of a pool that is completely in contrast to the architecture.
Right,
completely,
but it's
totally
not
different.
Focal, it's not, and again, we're focusing, we just keep saying, some of us just keep saying pool, and it's not just about the
I understand it's not about the
whole
pool. I
property.
understand.
And that pool is a very contemporary pool, as I suggested before, which is one small element, almost like a sculpture, in a bigger backyard that is much more natural.
It's actually the only thing in the backyard.
That's not
It goes 3 feet and then down. There's nothing in the backyard. That house is all front yard.
I've
Jane.
only been there once.
Would you like to address the?
Just to address, the issue of precedent's difficult. I think it's really important for the commission and everyone to remember that your decisions are not precedential. We can be informed by precedent, but every decision is made on a case-by-case basis. And since we're talking about certain things that are less objective, the feel of the rear yard of one house versus another, it may be worth discussing. There may be valuable points to be made, but the fact that a house was designated with a pool that's not in keeping with its style doesn't mean that we necessarily will do another one. And also I want to remind you, we're talking about the Mills Act right now more than designation. This house could still be recommended for designation without a Mills Act contract as an option. It's not an option I recommend, but it's out there as a possibility.
And to my colleague's earlier comments, I think you're right. When the house was built in the 1920s, the backyard would have been just pure nature and landscaping and maybe some terracing and a garden, a victory garden, whatever it might be, fruit trees. There are other homes in the neighborhood that still retain some of that original terracing that is much more natural, that comes down, sort of meander down the back of the yard. And so in terms of context, you're right. This pool would not have been this yard, this type of terracing with this grand focal point would not have been envisioned at that time.
And
You may speak.
we don't know the original condition. There very likely could have been some type of terracing. When this house was built, they weren't using cinder blocks, so if indeed all of those terrace walls are block, that's a later addition. But there certainly was the technology to terrace hillsides, and that's a possible way this was addressed originally.
I think there might have been someone from the public that wanted to speak again. Are you willing to open the public hearing again?
Who's that?
Yeah.
Do you have
Sure.
comments before we do that? Okay, hang on. I would like to open the public hearing. You may come forward, Steve.
Scott.
Scott, sorry.
If I may borrow one of the photographs that I...
Sure.
Oops. It is this one. The condition of the yard that the Odoms purchased is exactly what's here without the pool. We didn't add one retaining wall. We added one reinforcing wall in front of an existing retaining wall. So all of those big blank walls that everyone is obsessing about were there when they bought the house. Now, during the process of taking out the pool, the lawn area that was in the back where the pool is sitting, there was no patio in that space. There was a 4-foot walkway across the back of the house. So there was nothing back there. So being able to give them space in which to sit and entertain around a swimming pool where you can, the only type of permeable access for that back area would have been lawn. The upper areas on to the left and right of the pool would be unacceptable for having lawn in them because they're too narrow and they would not live very long. The part against the back of the house is in shade 90% of the time because it's on the north side of the yard. So the lawn would never have really survived particularly well across the back of there either. So in reality, the space was, we dropped in a pool into an existing space. We did not move one wall to create this backyard. It was what they had to begin with. And most of what I can see from what I looked at and from the age of what I was there, it had been there for quite some time. So I take great issue with the material choices. The house is entirely in stucco, and the tile is absolutely appropriate for the era and the age of the house. Yes, it is a rectangular pool, but that's because they needed to have a pool cover on it to protect their children. It could have been oval, it could have been softer in all of its things, but that would not have given them the protection for their children in the pool, and that was paramount first. And the second area was to be able to have an area to walk without having to drag dirt or grass or anything else up into the pool to keep the backyard as clean as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
close the public hearing.
No,
with
you had a question?
Well, I just wanted to know our list.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you can go on. It's just that I'm listing the 4 things that we have listed from the last time.
Please.
Unfortunately, I don't see any of them having been done. You know, I'm still looking at, and they've said like you have said, they've said what they can do, what they have been able to do, and we're still at loggerheads as to where to go with this thing. So,
Jay, the motion that was made last time, and that is done now? We would make a new one?
The motion was to continue. So
it was just continue.
Yeah, no
Continuation of the
decision was
hearing.
made.
There wasn't a motion.
Okay. So there was no motion. Okay.
But there was a motion to continue.
To continue, which we've done now.
But there's no decision made. There was guidance given to the applicant.
Do I have a motion? Are we ready for that? Or you have more discussion?
well, it's the same thing. I just, the 4 things that they requested. The backyard should be historically integral. To soften up the backyard landscape. Less concrete, reduce materials. and create a backyard as an homage to the house. But it doesn't seem like, and the architect has been very good about telling what he can and can't do on it, but it seems like the 4 things that we've requested haven't been addressed. So that's
correct.
that is my problem with this thing. I love the house. I mean, I love the house. I grew across the street, catty corner to this house. I've known this house longer than any of you people probably have been alive. So,
And you never played in the backyard. You can't tell us what it was like.
no, unfortunately, the people were never home. But I love the house. It defines Royal Boulevard. So I just have this problem with, we set this direction. I thought we're going to come back with something great. But what we've got is, well, we really can't do this and we really can't do that. And I understand there are things that you can't do. And that's my concern on this. Unfortunately, I would, without a problem, put it on the Glendale Register. But I have a problem with the Mills Act, which I've already stated. So
I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to recommend that the Historic Preservation Commission recommend to the City Council that the property at 1450 Royal Boulevard, to be called the Tupper House, be designated as a historic resource in the Glendale Register of Historic Resources, and that the City Council authorize City Manager to enter into a Mills Act contract with the property owners for tax property savings.
With no conditions.
With no conditions.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Roll call, please.
One
When you are done writing.
Yeah. I need Armine. All right. Commissioner Doom?
Yes.
Commissioner Crignati?
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan?
no.
Commissioner Vartanian?
No.
Commissioner Shire?
No.
Motion does not pass. 2 to 3. Is there another motion to entertain?
I move that the HPC recommend to City Council that, sorry, I'm having a hard time formulating my motion here, that the property at 1450 Royal not be designated on the Register of Historic Resources, and that a Mills Act contract not be entered into.
Is there a second? I will second if no one else.
You have to officially pass the gavel.
Is there a second from
Vice Chair.
No,
anyone?
I want it to be on the register.
Okay, so I'd like to pass.
Right.
You can pass it to me.
Vice Chair.
It's a metaphor.
I will second the motion.
Okay. And roll call, Commissioner Shire?
Yes.
Commissioner, wow, I think I did that. Well, it doesn't really matter. Commissioner Vartanian?
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan?
No.
Commissioner, what's your name? Crignati?
No.
Commissioner Doom?
No.
Motion does not pass. 2 to 3. If I can suggest options at this point.
Please.
One option would be to nominate for the Register, but not for the Mills Act. And that would then go to council with that recommendation. Council would have the option or opportunity to override the commission on the Mills Act. Another option, and I think we'd have to open the hearing again, and based on the history here, I'm not sure that this would fly, but you could continue the hearing again, giving direction to the applicant about what you're looking for, and they could return, but I wouldn't do that unless they indicated an openness to making bigger changes.
For the registry?
For both.
Based on Jay's input, is there another motion to consider?
I will consider Jay's motion, which is putting it on the Glendale Register, but not the Mills Act.
That's
Is that an official motion?
That's an official motion.
Is there a second? So that would be on the register, no Mills Act, no condition.
Right.
Is there a second for that motion?
There is no second. Hearing none.
I will pass the baton to Lorna,
Okay.
and I will second that motion.
Okay.
Can we have discussion?
Not generally at this point.
Oh.
So it's a motion's in action, so you can vote accordingly. Commissioner Shire?
No.
Oh. Yeah, you second. I understand. Okay, it just gets more complicated. Commissioner Vartanian?
No.
Commissioner Morgan?
Yes.
Okay, let me keep track here. Commissioner Crignati?
No.
And Commissioner Doom?
With all these motions, just to make sure this is the right one I understand, we're making a motion to put it on the register to recommend to council.
Without
Without-
Mills Act contract.
And without
The Mills Act contract.
the Mills Act contract.
Yeah, they're always two separate issues.
So by voting no, I vote against recommending it to the council.
You vote against this motion. There
I vote
could
against
be
the
other
motion.
motions that do different things,
Okay.
although we're running out of options.
No.
No. Okay, motion does not pass 1-4. I tell you, we need something. So, yeah, we can't go to council without a recommendation. So well, if that's where this ends, we'll have to continue. I'll have to talk to the city attorney, and then we'll have to talk about it again. I've never heard of that. So, have we explored all of the permutations here?
We can continue.
Well, your option of continuation, we've given the current homeowner a year to do exactly as we directed and offered to continue the hearing for, or continue the agenda item. So I don't see giving any more time is going to be solving this effort unless
This could be a time to check with the applicant, only because the applicant may have pinned their hopes on the commission being swayed by some of the discussion you've heard from the consultant and from the Historical Society. Seeing that hasn't swayed a majority of the commission, they may be inclined now to do something differently, but I would recommend opening and asking that.
Okay, I'll open the public hearing, and if the homeowner could come forward.
So I think what I'd like to know is what are my options?
Well, I think what we would like to know from you is a year ago, we provided a continuation for the hearing for you to reevaluate based on our comments of aesthetics, setting, integrity of the entire backyard. And there was specific criteria that we had offered up. Are you willing to do that? And would you like a continuation of the agenda item in order to address those more specifically? Because in the past year, none of those have been addressed.
Okay, if I got specifics. When I came here, when we discussed it last time, there were no specifics of use X material, use X kind of plant, use X kind of
Okay,
pot.
last year we offered that you could work with staff
I did.
in the meantime to come to that. And so our specifics are with a direction that you should head in, and then you would work with staff on more details or your architect landscape.
And
Respect-
if the commission would like to provide additional guidance, the
Thank you.
design review board sometimes has very broad conditions and sometimes very specific ones.
So I think we're asking you, what are you willing to do, so we know if that's even in line with what our direction was a year ago.
If I can suggest that it looks like they've begun to address some of the landscape issues with the walls in terms of softening those walls with larger, more screening types of landscaping. The big issues are the amount of concrete, the blankness of the deck area, and if I'm speaking correctly, I think the commission at the last hearing was concerned not about the tiles themselves, but about the way they're deployed and arranged in the back. So I would say that if my memory is correct, it would also be something about retiling of the rear wall. I'm not sure about the underside of the pool wall facing the deck.
Jay, if she came to you tomorrow and said, what recommendations would you make? Do you have some in mind?
We, as staff, work with applicants who bring designs to us. We try very hard not to be the designers. In fact, we are not supposed to be the designers.
So actually, last year we sent the owner back to meet with their designer and to come back to us, not necessarily to meet with staff for that guidance.
Yeah, the expectation would be that we would work with Roxanne
right.
and Scott. They would provide some initial ideas. I would give feedback. We would work back and forth. That's how our design review meetings generally work. We would come to a point where we either agree that it's wonderful, or that Roxanne says this is all I'm willing to do, and then we would reschedule the hearing and bring it back for you.
So the issue is the main first level of the patio is what? You would want it to be a more permeable surface. You mentioned flagstone, but flagstone isn't permeable. So
When it has grass in between, it is.
okay, so you would like to see grass.
No, we're not going to be the
specifying.
designers of the material.
Well, I think the
so-
homeowner deserves some guidance, because otherwise
Yeah,
it's a little bit
we
confusing.
provided that, or Jay could summarize.
Yeah,
again.
and that would be an option if we say there's too much concrete, flagstone with laden bed of sand with permeable joints, whether it's grass, gravel, or something else, could be an option. Again, you know, the commission can choose to give as much guidance or as little as you would like.
I would like to give a lot of guidance.
Then let's
Go forward.
Let's bring
Okay.
it on.
Well, let me rephrase that. I would like the commissioners that have an issue with the way it is, to give as much guidance as possible, because this feels a lot like the make the fountain work circumstance that we had a few years back that left the homeowner with no guidance. So the first level, I'm hearing permeable surface. Second level with the pool.
Could I speak for a second?
Sure.
So in keeping with the HRG's report and with the owner's architect, landscape designer, I believe there's enough substance to coming up with designs that would speak to setting, feeling, aesthetic, historic sense, compatibility with the architectural style of the home, and that along with hearing from last year and comments today, that they would have enough to make some design suggestions to Jay and to staff and go from there.
So not one of you can tell me specific materials that you would like to see in my backyard that you're rejecting or continuing or whatever it is. You can't tell me what to put in there.
Well, I guess we've heard
That's-
flagstone and grass. That's one start.
Grass won't live back there.
That's not our position to do that. So,
But you can tell me what I have isn't right.
If I may jump in, I think there are many options. I don't think you're going to get a specific laundry list right here. The commission might want to put a time frame on any continuation, though we can either continue to a date certain or to a open date. What I'm hearing is that I think we would need to reconsider the application of the tile, not necessarily the Malibu tiles themselves. We'd have to talk about the amount of concrete at the deck between the pool and the house. You've already said that you were interested in providing planters and some other landscape that could also help soften that area. So I don't think there's not a huge range of options. What the pattern of any new tile work would be. One of the things that jumps out at me that says this is not particularly a traditional feature are these diamonds kind of floating in a blank background. That's sometimes you'll have a panel of tile, but it's a very different setting than something like this. It could be as simple as changing some of those patterns, but I don't want to speak for the commission if I'm saying anything that's against the direction you're considering. But I'm very comfortable working with you, and we didn't have the chance to do that last time. We just met the one time and never took it forward. But it's very standard for me to work with conditions, broadly drawn conditions imposed by the boards or commissions, work with the applicant, and like I said, we see how far we can take it. And if you're happy and I can make a positive recommendation that you've met the condition, hopefully everyone's happy. If there's still some deviation, we'll bring you back and we'll see how it goes.
yeah.
May I ask, Commissioner Morgan, those 4 things you listed, are they written down in the report? I couldn't find them.
They're
Or
on the video.
They're in the video?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I didn't pay attention to the video. But you have them written down? Could I see them?
Yeah, if you can read my writing.
Okay.
Or do you want to just
I'll write them
It would
down.
be delightful to have those read into the record, and I will jot them down. So,
Well,
Okay.
Commissioner Vidoar, who was our chairperson at the time, a date uncertain with public notices, which is today. The backyard should be historically integral. Number 2 was soften up the backyard landscape. 3 was less concrete, reduce materials and angles. 3, create background as an homage to the house, the Spanish colonial architecture, which was then summarized by, at the time, Desiree Shire, just Commissioner Shire. where she said, redesign the issue of the backyard more in keeping with Spanish colonial architecture and style of home, a holistic, retaining high level with the Spanish colonial integrity of the house throughout, including the landscape, the hardscape, and the materials. So basically, they wanted it for the whole bit, from the beginning to the end. So you wouldn't be going back and forth. This is what the backyard looks like, this is what the front yard looks like.
So it sounds like we should be able to make a motion to move this forward with those simple conditions, that the backyard be redesigned and reevaluated and redesigned to be more in line with a Spanish colonial house. It seems like we're doing the work of the conditions prior to actually approving it, when really the conditions, these should be just imposed as conditions like we do on every house.
Well, that would be true if this were a design review hearing. As a Mills Act hearing, our Mills Act conditions tend to be very specific within reason. You know, it's replace the garage door with a new door more appropriate to the style of the house. So there is the latitude to what is appropriate to the house, and that's where I work with the applicant to figure that out. We have had trouble in the past with open-ended Mills Act conditions that are they met, are they not met? Staff would highly recommend that we not approve this with a broad set of conditions that are as broad as these, or as kind of amorphous as these.
Well, so that's interesting. We can impose a Mills Act condition that says you have to change the garage door to something specific, but we can't impose a Mills Act condition that says we would like a planter put in here to soften the hardscape.
Given the level and the extent, the use of the word holistic here, I think we're looking at such a big picture kind of solution that has so many potential resolutions, and I don't think if the applicant is open to a continuation and us working together and bringing this back, I don't see why we would kind of do an approval with these kind of broadly drawn conditions at this point, especially given the kind of the split on the commission and the difficulty coming to any motion. Going to council with that kind of indecision is not in the applicant's interest.
Can we still visit the house?
Yeah, if you continue the item, we can set up a site visit and.
I wasn't here last time.
So I guess we're asking, are you willing to work with your architect, designer, landscaper, and present designs to Jay? Therefore, it'd be beneficial for us to continue the hearing.
Yes.
It's better than a no.
So one more round.
Should we
Round
select
two.
a time frame? Is there something you'd like to suggest to us as far as coming back? What would be reasonable to you?
December.
And if we do December, I recommend we make that
January, right.
Because our hearings at the end of the year, we usually combine November and December, and we don't know exactly when that's going to be.
Sure.
So looking at does anyone have their calendar here?
Yeah.
It's the third Thursday in January.
We have the third Thursday would be the 18th, January 18th, 2018.
Okay, so that
Okay.
is a possible motion there.
Okay, do we have a motion for continuation to January 18th?
Yes.
So moved. Second.
Do we need to add? Okay.
Yeah.
Do we need to add any of the verbiage, or you have all that from the meeting?
We may as well, here long enough, but the goals working with the applicant will be to better reflect the Spanish colonial revival style of the house and the existing kind of outdoor spaces around the house. We will soften the landscape areas, the kind of stucco wall areas. We'll find a way to provide less concrete on the back deck area. I'm not sure, it was mentioned to reduce the number of angles. I think those are one of the things that may help differentiate this in terms of the raised pool, and I'm not sure that was an issue for the commissioners.
Maybe it was more the tile angle.
The diamonds.
Right.
Yeah. What I'm picturing just off the top of my head is possibly a tile bands and panels, vertical panels rather than the diamond shapes.
I think the commission at the time had also felt there were too many corners. I think that was the angle issue.
Is it too many corners of the pool, or That I listened to the tape also, and I wasn't sure what that meant. So,
Yeah,
we just try to soften, just see what we can do to soften it. I mean, again, I think the design inspiration for the pool was the cover, and that's why we do have so many hard angles there.
although in fairness, pools traditionally built during the era of this house would have been rectangular, almost always. They might have had little rounded corners with the copings, but it would be considerably more difficult, I think, to change any of the concrete caps along the pool edge than it would be to change the tile. So just let me know if you want me to work with the applicant about the concrete at the top.
Actually, is there a way to soften the coping?
Yep, may I ask,
Something more undulating?
So, Lorna, Commissioner Martin, were you concerned about the edge of the pool closest to us in the bottom, the corner, if it was smooth on the outside and on the pool on the inside, or is it a different tile as well, appearance?
No, the tile is fine. I think the banding.
It's the corner.
Banded tile. And again, I'm just reiterating what was the items that were mentioned at the last meeting. So we talked about corners and sharp edges. And again, I don't know to what extent that can be addressed.
That's a way to possibly help that.
I was going to recommend.
I think I hear. I guess my question was: is that an issue? And it seems to still be an issue, and perhaps.
And maybe not if my colleagues don't feel the same way. I don't know.
I was going to recommend that perhaps you guys can walk the front of the property and see if there are some things on the building, on the structure itself, that would provide some basic guidance. You know, it's interesting, the banding, the comment about the banding. You're talking about in front of the spa, that band. I mean, if you look at the front of the house, the windows have a band of tile around them. The steps have a band of tile around them.
Banding is appropriate.
Can we be careful? We have a motion on the table, so we should really limit the discussion. We're trying to provide enough clarity for Jay to read into the report what we're voting on.
I feel comfortable based on my notes from last year's hearing, my review of the tape, and your discussion. I feel comfortable that these kind of 4 items pretty much distill the general goal. So
roll call, please.
Thank you. Let's see.
Or do we need a refresher on what the motion is on the table before we vote?
I actually have that. January motion to continue the item to January 18th next year. Vote, Commissioner Crignati?
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan?
Yes.
Commissioner Vartanian?
Yes.
Commissioner Doom?
Yes.
Commissioner Shire?
Yes.
5-0.
Yay.
Thank you.
Sort of.
All right, we'll move on to agenda item 8B. This is the commission discussion and feedback regarding the preliminary draft of the South Glendale Historic Resources Survey.
At least we've got an easy one now.
They're all dead.
Okay. I wanted to begin the discussion just by kind of explaining how I envision this process working as we continue. As you remember, at last month's hearing, you received a report from Historic Resources Group containing their preliminary findings for the South Glendale survey. We are now in the initial public review phases, and at this point we're just reviewing the survey. Ultimately, this survey is going to be part of the South Glendale Community Plan, which has to go through an environmental review, and there's going to be a draft EIR. And because this document is attached to the South Glendale Community Plan, it's going to go through further review. So there's going to be an ongoing series of meetings open to the public where we're going to be taking feedback and then bringing that feedback, consolidating it, working with our consultant to find out how they believe that the new feedback is working within the framework of the existing methodology, and whether they can make recommendations to incorporate some of that feedback, or whether they may disagree with that feedback, either in total or just as a matter of degree, which status code they would select. So what we asked, and then last month also you received, there was a presentation and a handout delivered by the Glendale Historical Society identifying a number of properties, but by no means all of the properties that they had found at that point that they thought had either been missed in the survey or that they disagreed with some of the findings. And so they made their recommendations. We have consolidated all of their up to date, all of their findings, and we provided those for you in a paper document that we're going to be reviewing as part of item 10A tonight. In terms of item 9.8B, which is old business, which we're talking about now, what we're hoping to hear from the commission, and the way we presented it to you last month, was to get your feedback on the initial presentation by HRG, on the initial findings that they had made, and on the methodology that they've selected. All of the commission's comments are going to be taken down. We're not going to be committing. If the commission said, we agree with this, we disagree with that, we think you missed that, we're not, the commission by fiat doesn't create those, but we're taking all of that back to the consultant, just as we have with the Historical Society, and just as we will with any other public comment that we get, and trying to feed new information into our existing methodology, and then ultimately into the spreadsheet of all of the properties that are being surveyed. So, so tonight, what I'm hoping to get is your feedback on what you heard from HRG, and you can certainly provide feedback on what you heard from the Historical Society last month. The Historical Society has found some additional properties that they wanted to introduce to you tonight, so they've given us a slide presentation, and they'll be discussing that during the public portion of this. But when it comes to the commission discussion, it's kind of your call. I don't have any expectation of how the discussion's going to go. So I'll just be taking notes furiously and asking you to slow down, perhaps.
Okay. Should we open the public hearing then for the presentation first?
That's generally how we'll do it.
So Catherine Yurka.
Is it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Get that going, and I'll give you the what's it called? Keyboard in a second.
Oh, I have key.
Is this one SGAS? This one? Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kathy Yerk. I'm here on behalf of the Glendale Historical Society. This PowerPoint is not the clean, coherent machine that the last one is. It's a little more scattered, in part because we no longer have as much time as we did. So we're filling in as best we can, and it will not be as long. It's a little bit hard to read. One thing we did not look at was planning districts, because we had no information about them except the name. Which wasn't much to go on. So Geneva, Howard, and Isabel are 3 streets that run between East Doran and Lexington. When I walked them as part of our review, I thought, oh, this might be a historic district, but there was no way I could take that on. So I just let it go. But when I discovered it was a planning district, I walked it again, and we feel that it actually should be reconsidered as a historic district. The description of the planning district, as you'll note, says that it's comprised of single-family residences primarily constructed in the 1920s and that are 1 story in height. In fact, Geneva, which only runs along 1 block because there's a school, an eligible historic resource on the other side, is actually mostly small early apartment buildings and duplexes. There are only 6 single-family houses as compared with 13 multifamily. And of course, a period of significance would need to be created for it, but based on the architecture, it would seem that as many as 16 of 19 of those would be considered contributors. Sorry, I should be showing you these. And I'm terrible with PowerPoint, so these are just 4 random photos of some of the multifamily that I found. Howard also is a street that again, these are random. Not every house looks like this. This is a street that is single family, and some of these we submitted for consideration as individual resources. I haven't checked, but I'm not optimistic. However, there is a high level of contributors on the street, and Glendale is they don't appear to be radically altered the way that the commentary on the planning district says. Basically, they're too altered to be considered a historic district. Glendale can be rather charitable when it comes to alterations on historic district contributors. And just, to point out, when's the last time the HPC reviewed alterations to a contributor? Those are handled at the staff level. They're found to changes to contributors are handled outside of your purview, typically. There are some larger, newer apartment buildings on Isabel, and those would be non-contributors. But I think well more than 60% of the properties on these 3 blocks would be contributors. So I would suggest that this be reviewed. I don't know how planning districts map onto historic districts, but I think it's worth considering. And then I couldn't help myself. So the East, we also just didn't spend much time with historic districts. It was just overwhelming. But East Oran is right around the corner from the planning district. And this property was identified as a contributor to the historic district, but not individually eligible. It was identified as a minimal traditional. It's from 1937, but it appears to be streamlined moderne. And that's a rare style in Glendale. I think there's only one other streamlined moderne apartment building, and it's one that we found. So I would like that to be considered not just as a contributor, but as a contributor and individually eligible. This pair of buildings is right next door. They're treated as separate buildings, but they're twins, and they're a kind of a garden apartment. And they're minimal traditional. It's a little hard to see, but they have pretty distinctive features. The decorative windows in the bay, you probably can't see it. I don't. And then also the octagonal windows on the top floors. And the only alteration that was noted on this was awnings. And the awnings come up over and over again. Awnings are reversible alterations. So I think that this also should be considered for individual eligibility. And then this one is a nice surprise because the owner would like it on the survey and would like it to be found eligible. It's a 1909 transitional craftsman. It's at 419 Vine. The owner is restoring it with the help of a historic architect named Virginia Paca. Most of the windows are original. A few were replaced, but they were replaced in kind. The garage is not original, but this is from the first decade of the 20th century. It is intact. It's on Vine Street, which is badly altered, a street of craftsman houses. It's really just been decimated. Here are 2 other hipped roof cottages or transitional craftsmen that TGHS identified. The one on the top is 131 North Adams. That was found to be 5S3. That's what we recommended, even though all the windows have been replaced. 1123 East Broadway was found to be, the one on top is 1898, the one on the bottom is 1910. That was found to be 6L. The siding has been replaced. I don't know why the disparity, because HRG's, the registration requirements don't differentiate between buildings from the 1890s and a building from 1910. So I don't know why one is 5S3 with one alteration, one is 6L with a kind of analogous alteration. But anyway, they suggest that that this one might well be considered 5S3 because it is intact and it's of a similar style. And I have to say that having had this property identified, we missed it, HRG missed it, and I've talked to the architect, and it wasn't like it was in a state of chaos. It was really intact. And that's just what I find so alarming about this process. Like, unless we had not been in contact with them, this is and this is one of the few on Vine that's in this kind of condition. And a last point that I wanted to make, and that's that buildings that were surveyed and found eligible in a city-adopted survey, if their status code is being changed, that change needs to be justified. So you've already seen the Dunn Edwards building. That was found to be locally eligible. And I can't remember if it was local or California. That was not on the survey. The Great White Hut was found to be, and the Sarmiento building. The Sarmiento building, remember, was not surveyed at all.
No.
It was not.
It was.
It was not listed in the survey.
I know, but It was surveyed, and you'll find out when you go through all of the new materials.
I have gone through.
This is a process.
Okay, I actually have gone through those materials.
The materials you received tonight.
I went through the ones for these two, so
Okay.
so if you'll allow me to continue.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I've never done that before, but I felt emotional.
So the Great White Hut was found eligible for the National and California Register. It's been downgraded to locally eligible. There's no explanation for that in the materials that we received. It just says it was already found eligible locally. The Sarmiento building was found national and California Register eligible in that downtown survey. That also was downgraded. The comments that HRG provided for why they say it's no longer found eligible for the National or California Register. In fact, they did find it eligible for the California Register. They just somehow missed that fact when they were writing their comments. They say that it's missing spandrel panels, that those were removed. I think that's the louvers.
No.
Is that the same thing? That's something different?
It's a spandrel glass between the vision glass.
Okay. So they've come up with a rationale for why it's no longer National or California Register eligible, but they still find it eligible for the California Register. So I don't know what that's about. But there needs to be a kind of accounting for all the properties for why they, if there's been a change in status code. I just have two more slides. So this is a house at 316 West Acacia. This was found eligible 5S3 in the 2006 Craftsman Survey, which was adopted by the city in 1923. It was actually called out in that survey as an example of the clipped colonial craftsman subtype. I just love this example because sometimes there's a kind of slight asymmetry to them, but this one is so wildly asymmetrical with the door and the side lights so far on the side. We had identified in the survey asking that it be restored to 5S3. They just left it at 6L. And I will point out that the Craftsman Survey was not generous with its historic resource status codes. It was very generous with 6L because it basically labeled everything that wasn't a historic resource 6L. There were no 6Zs at all. But when a property's been surveyed, again, there should be this accounting of why. Why was it eligible 10 years ago when we had more of these, when there were fewer demolitions, both of this subtype and of the Craftsman in general? Why is it now a 6L? And especially, I have a hard time understanding why that's a 6L. And this property, 716 South Louise from 1921, was added to the survey as a 6L. This is the only property in the survey that was released to the public that was added without our input. And it could be, Jay, you might know why this would have been added. I will point out that it's 1921, so it's post-1918. It has composite siding, so the siding has been replaced.
This one shouldn't have been added as a 5, you're saying?
No, it's a 6L.
Oh, it could be a 6, yeah.
And it has composite siding on the columns as well, and which seems to me like a really kind of strange. I mean, there was no explanation, so I don't know why. But I'm just really have a hard time seeing like that as a 6L, and this, which is intact and has all of its character-defining features and was identified as a 5S3 in the previous Craftsman survey. Why there's we'll be going through the materials, but it's this kind of inconsistency that we've just really struggled with, especially as volunteers and especially as a team, I'm hard-pressed to call myself an amateur at this point, but I'm definitely a non-professional. And so it's been a big job. But anyway, thank you for your time.
Could I get the keyboard?
Oh, yeah.
What was the last address? I'm trying to keep track. The 716.
716. South.
That was West Acacia also?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Can I make a comment on her thing? Sorry. On what she said?
Yeah.
Okay. HRG has a huge task ahead of them, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that some of that stuff may be simple, maybe not necessarily typographical errors, but sorting errors. I was recently reviewing the 2012 North Cumberland Heights survey, and there's a major, well, depending on how you look at these things, I would consider it kind of a major formatting problem in the grid. The Excel spreadsheet, I guess, is probably what it was, that identifies the architectural style of a home, its code, whether it's a contributor, and then its APN number. Somewhere in the Idlewoods, in the high Idlewood numbers, the architectural style for one of the properties and its APN is not the correct one, and so everything below it shifted up one, so they're completely out of alignment. And that's something that HRG will have to fix for us, hopefully someday soon. So it's very possible that a lot of these things are just simple mechanical sorting issues.
Yeah.
Hopefully they'll do a lot of proofreading.
Just to address that one, Chris has mentioned that to me. I still haven't looked at it closely, so please let's talk about it.
Okay.
Because that's probably not even a sorting error. It's probably a spreadsheet error.
That's what I mean,
All the
like-
columns kind of moved around.
Yeah.
But the DPR forms, hopefully...
The DPR forms are correct. I just reviewed it
the
again
DPR
today, yeah.
forms are what we use.
Yeah.
And that's what goes to the public also, so at least that public knowledge information is...
Yeah. So that part's correct, and actually the codings were correct. It was just the style and the APNs that were off.
Okay.
Okay, we have another speaker, Francesca Smith.
Hi, thank you. I worked on a PowerPoint today. I spent the day with the State Historic Preservation Officer. I printed out 10 copies for you all, and they're on my desk. I apologize. So I'm going to run through this, and I'm going to give it to Jay, I guess, for the record, or maybe they can pass it around, because it's all pretty.
Oh.
So
If you can email it to us later.
These are my professional notes on the South Glendale local survey process. As you know, I'm an architectural historian for a state agency. I review consultants' work pretty much for a living, and we comment on them a lot. One of the most important things, last month when we met, a number of defects that we're hoping will be corrected were brought up, including excessively restrictive landmark registration criteria that exceeds the National Historic Landmark criteria, as well as national and California register requirements, and there are none for integrity in the Glendale Municipal Code for local landmarks. We had a brief discussion, I think, about how the methodology and the registration requirements in the context statement don't jibe. And I just wanted to iterate again that the Glendale Historical Society was not consulted, coordinated, or collaborated with on any components on the survey, and what an important part of any local survey that normally is. And I'm also going to address very briefly periods of significance. So in your PowerPoint, you will note on the California Office of Historic Preservation website, there's guidance on performing local surveys. And in that, they refer to both National Register Bulletin 24, which is guidelines for local surveys, a basis for preservation planning that's prepared by the National Park Service, and the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines for Archaeology and Historic Preservation. Your next PowerPoint slide is from Bulletin 24. And the National Park Service clearly directs that local preservation planning calls for public involvement. We've been inserting ourselves in the process, you may have noticed. Preservation planning, it says, includes participation. The planning process should be provided a forum for open discussion of preservation issues. And it's in bold in your fantastic PowerPoint. Public involvement is most meaningful when it is used to assist in defining values of properties and preservation planning issues. Here's the big bold part, rather than when it is limited to a review of decisions already made. So I'm just saying, and the early and continuing public participation is essential to the broad acceptance of preservation planning decisions. Also in Bulletin 24, under certified local governments and how surveys contribute to their certification, it states, to be certified, a local government program must enforce appropriate state and local historic preservation legislation, establish and maintain a qualified historic preservation review commission, provide for adequate public participation in its activities. That part is underlined. We know the commission is providing for adequate public participation, but I will tell you I'm not feeling it in the survey. And then there's a bunch of other mumbo jumbo. Also in Preservation Brief 24, it asserts under managing the process, the planning process. The success of the preservation planning process depends on how well it solicits and integrates the views of various groups. Just thinking the Glendale Historical Society would be one, and we haven't been solicited. We have absolutely volunteered all of our time in this, as you all know. Again, in Preservation Brief 24, there's a list that I think I provided last time that is numbered, and it talks about how important public participation is and how integral it is to this approach, and it involves involving historians, architectural historians, folklorists, and persons from related disciplines to define, review, and revise the historic context, goals, and priorities. So we're trying to provide that, and we are providing that to you in lieu of elsewise, involving interested individuals, organizations, and communities in the planning area in defining the kinds of historic properties that may exist and suitable protective measures, and involving prospective users of the preservation plan in defining issues, goals, and priorities, and providing coordination with other planning efforts at local, state, regional, and national levels as appropriate. There's even more from Preservation Brief 24, and it talks about creating mechanisms for identifying and resolving conflicts about historic preservation issues. So I am feeling we're having conflicts. And the development of historic context, for example, it says, should be based on the professional input of all disciplines involved in preservation and not be limited to a single discipline. By the way, the agreement talks about archaeology. There isn't a word of archaeology that I can find in the South Glendale survey. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong place, but I don't see it even mentioned. And then we get to the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Preservation Planning, which states that preservation planning includes public participation, and the planning process should be provided a forum for open discussion of preservation issues. And the bold part is public involvement is the most meaningful when it is used to assist in defining values of properties and preservation planning issues rather than being limited to what decisions had already been made. And lastly, the periods of significance defined in what we've looked at so far for most properties are a single year. As you know, I review these things for a living. There aren't very many properties that have a single year for a period of significance. There are properties where it can be possible, but I'll give you all some guidance on that for the city to think about. So mostly these are for architecturally significant properties. That's under criterion C. The period of significance, which is a period, not normally a year, is the date of construction and or the dates of any significant alterations and additions. Not if a building was built in 1921 and the original owners added a room to the back 3 years later, it can't be a local landmark because it has an alteration. It defies preservation professional practice, and that in that the consultants were given a huge assignment, but it's excessively restrictive in allowing 0 alterations to anything, even during what should probably be recognized as the period of significance. So a property must possess historic integrity for all periods of significance. Some properties have different periods of significance for different criteria. The period of significance is based on the time when the property made the contributions or achieved the historic character on which it's based. So normally it's a period, not a single year. I scold consultants when they provide a single year for a period of significance because it's normally not justified. It's normally a continuum of years. It may be 2 years, it may be 15 years, sometimes it's 100 years, not very often, but in the case of almost everything that I've looked at, it's a single year for a period of significance, which provides for no flexibility for alterations. And as you know, there can be alterations that have been made to National Register properties, National Historic Landmarks, as you learned last month, California Register properties and even Glendale register properties like the Brand Library. So I appreciate you listening. Thank you.
Thank you for your
If
feedback.
you want to ask me questions, you can.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a quick question.
Yes. For me or Francesca?
No, for Francesca. So, I'm sorry, I might have just missed something. This 1 year period of significance, how is that being applied in the consultant's survey?
As far as I have noticed, when I look at things, because I have not reviewed it page by page. I've mostly looked at things by property. I have found most properties have a single period of significance.
Most?
So it's not normally a single year, as you learned. And Jay, maybe you can look at that table.
Well, all I can share is that the consultant has not spoken of period significance on a property-by-property basis. They've included the construction date for the properties, which is the standard thing to include in any survey.
Was the construction date, but the construction date isn't
when
normal.
Ms. Smith talks about period of significance involving alterations, the Secretary of the Interior talks about significant alterations that add meaning to the property.
Or happened long before World War II. Or
well, it is a slippery slope to start saying the period of significance for a house that has no associations, people or events, that is of limited architectural significance, and then we're going to extend a period of significance for one house to accommodate an addition from 1910, and then for another house for an addition from 1922. I think this alteration itself has to have gained significance in hindsight, not just be a thing that exists. And that's how the Secretary of the Interior looks at it.
But are you saying that the survey in and of itself isn't including at a property level periods of significance, because they'd have to be doing a substantial research on every single property?
I think the underlying situation here is a decision made about one property that recently came to the board.
Sorry, no, it's the whole thing.
But we don't discuss period of significance, and there are properties that are altered, especially earlier properties. The methodology allows for alterations to earlier properties and is less open to alterations for craftsmen, specifically for post-1918 properties. And that's part of the methodology developed by HRG. But the issue, I'm a little just baffled because it isn't something we've discussed much with HRG in their discussions. We're not sure how many properties we're really talking about.
As I recall, the periods of significance are included, and they're a single year, which I scold my consultants for doing, because most properties don't have a single year period of significance.
Most properties that are only eligible for their architecture have a single period of significance. It could range for 2 years if construction took that long, but the time that the original design, especially a work of a major architect, when the original design is completed, that is the end of that period of significance, unless the building has acquired significance for association with people or events, or additions have been made that gain significance in their own right, which is something we assess in hindsight looking back at it. We don't say that every addition made to a building extends its period of significance, and I think that's completely incorrect.
Correct. I don't think every alteration to a building extends its period of significance.
So
but
could you define your exact intent with the concern?
My intent is that in many ways, firstly, Glendale Historical Society is volunteering our opinions. We're not being officially consulted or asked or anything.
I'm sorry.
Which
As
is
it relates
important.
only to this period of significance,
okay,
I was asking for clarity.
Thanks. For period of significance, a lot of the time in other surveys in other communities, for instance, a craftsman property, the period of significance would be the craftsman period, not merely when that property was built, through when it was completed, because a 2-year period of significance is very restrictive.
And so what are you implying would be the downside or the upside to?
The upside would be more properties would be locally eligible, because there are numerous humble little houses that are a certain period or style, where the people moved in and the original owners, in many cases, realized they needed another room or so. Those additional rooms or so aren't very visible from the front and don't really detract from the property. And
I think we would all agree that
Okay,
those
yeah.
don't necessarily diminish a potential 5 code. There's not a blanket statement
great,
anywhere
good.
in the document
Yeah.
that you've read that
good. A
that
lot have been,
precludes.
unfortunately, as far as we can tell, because all we're getting are big tables, and maybe we're misinterpreting it.
No. You're correct that many of those probably have been found to not be significant as 5s
Because
or
of
higher.
alterations, when there's an alteration that's from within the first 10 years of the property's existence,
It's quite possible. It's case by case.
for
Yeah,
other
it'll be
which
case
for
by
other agencies like the state or the feds would not throw out the property. So
Yeah.
And for a local
I think we
community.
agree. It's not the criteria alone that throws something in or out. It's a case-by-case basis. But I appreciate the clarification. Thank you. Okay.
And here's your fantastic PowerPoint.
And just to clarify, this was TJHS testimony or personal testimony? Thank you. Just putting it on my notes, so you can have. Why don't you share that? Well, I don't. Does anyone want to see that? Or?
Pass it around.
Okay.
Oh, if you get the pages.
We don't even have a stapler.
Okay, with that, we'll
Boy.
with that we will close the public hearing.
Thanks, Frances.
Jay, would you mind just restating what the intent is or desire for tonight from the commission on this agenda topic?
First, if I can address some
sure.
of the statements that were just made about the public process.
Sure.
Last month's hearing, tonight's hearing, next month's hearing, multiple hearings beyond that are public hearings during which the decision-making bodies are hearing comments not just from the Historical Society, but from any other members of the public who are interested in discussing the survey, its methodology, its findings, or anything else. In discussing this with our consultant, Historic Resources Group is one of the premier consultants in the region. I think they have a national reputation. Christine Lazaretto, who's the project lead, is one of the most respected figures in our field in the area. Her experience suggests that the amount of input we've received from the Historical Society, which is very welcome and is part of this public process, is beyond anything that she has ever experienced in any of the surveys she's done for any other city. And in her experience, and she'll be at a future hearing if we need to direct this question to her, but my memory is that in her experience that she's never sat down with a local group or local people in developing a methodology or in field checking specific results. The survey is done in this manner by every consultant. The Craftsman survey was performed in this way, although the Craftsman survey did have a volunteer component where there was extensive educational outreach to get people up to speed to kind of do the survey. But in terms of developing the methodology and determining status codes, there was not this kind of input. So I would venture to say that this survey, certainly in Glendale's experience, but also in comparison to other cities, is going to have a much more robust public input, public feedback, opportunities to take into consideration. And the document that you received tonight that we're going to discuss in item 10B or whatever, 10A maybe, does show where the HRG has looked at the comments that we've received so far from the Historical Society, and in some cases agrees and in some cases disagrees. We will continue to do that up to a point. I think through email we discussed today that we will still be accepting more comments from the Historical Society. At some point that ends because we can't keep doing that forever. So we're hopeful that we'll get as much as possible before the survey is kind of put into the draft EIR and then goes to council ultimately for final approval. In terms of some of the properties that were addressed specifically, I just wanted to mention the house on Vine Street. I didn't realize that the owner has decided to restore that house, but I think it's very important for the commission to remember, and I think Christine Lazaretto mentioned this last week, as a surveyor on the ground, you are looking at what's on the ground today at the time of the survey, and we cannot presume that a property is going to be restored in the future, and that's why with some of the methodology has some of the issues that it has with stucco, with asbestos siding, et cetera. I would be thrilled to see this house brought back, and it would certainly be a candidate for the Glendale Register, possibly, if it's restored as well as it sounds like it might be. But during the time of the survey, it would be completely professionally inappropriate to change a survey finding just based on maybe something's going to happen. So I just wanted to let the Commission know about that. With regard to some of the other items presented, survey teams, surveyors there's reasonable room for disagreement. There's reasonable room for changing a previous status code, either raising it or lowering it. And it is ultimately HRG's intention, and they've already begun that through the form or through the spreadsheet you have. They're going to justify every decision that they're making. You're going to receive information explaining that. And if, as the Commission reads it or as the public reads it, anyone finds that explanation to be either vague, because some of it is boilerplate just because of the number of properties we're looking at, we could certainly highlight those and ask for deeper justification if we need it. So I just found it a little difficult to swallow, and that's why I reacted earlier to be told that we're not working with the public. We did have a request at last month's hearing to have a meeting directly between the consultant and the Historical Society. We discussed that with the City Attorney's Office, and their opinion was that that was privileging the Historical Society over other public groups or people who may be providing input over time. And the Attorney's Office found that the way we're doing this is completely appropriate and completely adequate to fulfill our needs to address community concerns.
And so everything that the Historical Society presents to us, you pass along to HRG.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Because they're not here. Okay.
Yeah, so I think the Historical Society is working on a new submittal similar to the previous ones. We've gotten 2 rounds of submittals. The item we'll be discussing next month that you have in front of you in the spreadsheet is a compilation of every property they've brought to us so far, and then a response from HRG. We'll do the same thing with the next submittal and also with the Historic District. And I am with the Historical Society. I have spent very little time looking at the historic districts. Planning areas, or what we're calling residential planning districts, is something that we asked HRG to include in this survey. It's something that right now we don't have any mechanism to establish a planning district. I think we talked about that last week or last month. It's something that I would personally like to do. It's ultimately going to be council's decision. It's an ordinance change to create this new kind of zoning mechanism. But having it as a recommendation is a good idea. It's not going to have any weight until we actually create that. To the point of whether or not this is a historic district rather than a planning district, we'll bring that up to HRG. Yeah, we should have.
Sorry, that's okay.
But we'll definitely be discussing that with HRG and finding out what their opinion is. The fact that there are some multifamily buildings in it, I believe all they say is that it's predominantly a single-family residential district, but I haven't looked at it closely enough to take it any further than that. So.
Will the survey be like a living document? Is it something like if a homeowner did 6L and they did some modifications and things, could they come back and have their DPR changed or updated if it was
Technically,
warranted?
it could be, just like in a historic district. If a building's torn down, if it burns, whatever, we have the ability to make those modest changes. It's not exactly a living document where it's going to be in flux all the time. They tend to sit on the shelf the way they came to us. But we would definitely want to keep track of things that are lost through demolition, things that are lost through alteration, things that are restored back to a greater period than where we found them. So,
right. And so then, to her question,
I realized I did. I answered that question without answering it. So, what we're hoping to hear from you tonight is an overall sense based on the presentation by both HRG and TGHS last month. Are you satisfied that the methodology is sound? Because the methodology is the key thing, and a lot of the disagreements that we may have as we move forward stem to the methodology that HRG's developed. I give HRG a lot of latitude, given their experience as the firm that developed our context, as a firm that was one of the lead firms in Survey LA, which gave all of our local preservation consultants a tremendous amount of experience doing surveys. And they also tailored it specifically to Glendale. So, and I can't remember if we mentioned last week, but in relation to craftsman architecture, HRG was, in their initial methodology, was going to exclude most properties from the 20s, and so that the Historical Society understands that we're working together on a lot of things. I said that's unacceptable in Glendale. That will not work for our community. We have to find a way to include those. Perhaps we have a higher threshold. Perhaps we have a different way of analyzing them, which is what ultimately happened. But the methodology was definitely tailored to some of the specific issues that they learned doing the context, and then also that I just learn on the ground every day. So it's definitely a Glendale-specific survey. It's also a very generous survey so far in terms of the number of 5 and higher categories that have been given. Many other cities, and strangely, I just looked at a survey that was done in Whittier by one of the local consultants a few years ago, and it was a resurvey of about 1,500 properties. And I can't remember the numbers, but the percentage as they broke it down by style. So, for example, they found 500 and some, or maybe even 700 and some craftsman houses. They found only less than 20 of those to be 5s. The percentage in a survey like that was a professionally produced survey, similar to what we're doing here, came out much lower than the percentages that we're looking at. So I'm comfortable that the methodology is being applied as fairly as possible across the broad spectrum of everything we're looking at and the number of properties. But going back to the initial question, we'd love feedback on methodology, and then any specific feedback. If individual commissioners disagree with some findings, that's the kind of feedback we're expecting, and we'll bring that back to HRG just the way we have from the Historical Society. We're not going to change it right now. We're going to look at everything as a group and start analyzing them. But we welcome, any comment, but on those two aspects especially.
And we'll have the ability to comment tonight as well as next month on specifics?
Yeah.
Okay.
It feels that this is going to be a long process to the point that commissioners will be able to comment as we move forward through the draft EIR review phase, where we're going to have a 60-day review period, and we can agendize discussions of the survey then if we still need to. At some point, I don't know how much we can keep going on it. I don't expect the Historical Society did a tremendous effort sending people out literally through the whole South Glendale area to look for things that were either overlooked or to find things where there may be disagreement. And just so you know, a lot of properties weren't overlooked. For example, the house on Vine Street would have been dismissed out of hand by the surveyors because it was, even though it's cute, even though it's stucco or it's old, it's stuccoed and it just doesn't meet the threshold for the methodology. So there are many, many properties that we would all think are very nice older houses that are not going to make it to even the 6L level.
And then just one more question on kind of what are the objectives for tonight. On the spreadsheets that you gave us and the photos, are you reviewing those more, like giving us an overview on those before you send us off to look at those, or?
The only overview I can give on those are the sum total to date of the properties that TGHS has submitted to staff for reconsideration or new evaluation.
Okay.
So it's either things that were not picked up by the survey, things that were picked up but dismissed by the survey, so they didn't even make it into the documents you saw, or there are things where there's disagreement about the status code.
Okay.
So the spreadsheet is organized alphabetically, and the photos go along with those, and the only way we could figure out to print the photos was with these little thumbnails. Hopefully that's enough to pique your interest, but I hate to say as you're going through it, if you're really digging, you may have to start going to Google and going to Street View and looking at things a little more carefully.
Oh, this is very helpful.
Yeah, so the input on what I gave you tonight, I officially agendized that as a briefing because it wasn't put on the agenda for tonight as a item where the public could download that. It will be on the agenda for next month's hearing as a whatever we call it, as a old business item. and then the public will have access to that also. And obviously, the Historical Society now has access to it.
Okay. So what I'd like to suggest tonight, if it is in line with everyone's thinking, we can give kind of general comments if we have those, but maybe we really wait till next month based on duration of meeting tonight and being fair to all of the work of the consultant and also TGHS to really review this and see if we can give you more solid feedback on methodology and or specifics, if that works.
It works. I just have a quick question.
Yeah, please.
So are we to assume that if there isn't a house on TGHS or HRG and we found a house, it's already been looked at and we should, like I'm looking at two that I looked at, 742 West Oran and 750, I believe, West Oran, that are of the 20s, and they're not on either of the lists. So has somebody already looked at them and did dismiss them at, so there's no reason to be even...
Ultimately, you're going to be getting a list of 6Z properties that HRG has looked at, meaning no historic significance. Right now, we have 5s and 6Ls and anything higher than a 5. You'll be getting a list of 6Zs, and there are going to be two kinds of 6Zs. The ones that they actually took a second look at and said, wait a second, let's think about this one. We're going to do some background research, and if that didn't pan out, they're giving it a 6Z. There are also many properties actually, that they just drove past and said, no, it doesn't meet what we're looking for in this survey. Ultimately, you can presume, right now they're still in flux because, and I have to emphasize again, this is a preliminary discussion of a preliminary survey, so nothing is finalized. But you can presume right now that if something's not on the HRG list, that HRG believes it's a 6Z. So if you dispute that or have other thoughts, whether it's a dispute or not, we would love to have you give us a list, whatever you're going to do, and we're going to take that back to HRG. We're going to look at it more carefully. We're going to find out, A, is it something they did look at and gave it a 6Z for whatever reason, or is it something? There's still the possibility that there are things that have been overlooked. They did survey every single block in the city, and but surveys. There's error in every survey.
So it would be okay then to submit a list of homes that we found that are on neither of the lists, and they can just check it out.
I think we've gotten good at that. We're very used to that, yeah.
Okay.
Question. So just to help me understand, so this list from HRG, this grid, is showing us what, these are all the properties submitted by TGHS, and these are the responses, like HRG has reviewed everything submitted, and these are their responses. So, for example,
again, this is agendized for later, but I don't think there's a problem. It's already out there, so I'll just explain it. If you look at most of these columns are columns that were produced by HRG using the Excel format that HRG developed for the survey. And then the ones that are germane, I think, for you are looking at the TGHS 2017 proposed status code versus the HRG 2017 proposed status code. And then adjacent to each of those are TGHS comments of why they thought that status code was appropriate, and then HRG comments of why they agree or disagree. So,
for example, sorry, if I may, just so on the third one down on the first page, 428 Windsor, it says TGHS.
We have a different
on the back.
Are you on the?
You're in the back.
Oh, sorry, I'm on the back. So on the last page, the third, it's stapled. That's funny.
Yeah.
It's stapled backwards. Okay. So the third one down, 428 Windsor. For example, it says TGHS proposed 5S3, and then the HRG status code is not surveyed, but the HRG comment says all pre-1918 properties reevaluated, added to list as 6L due to porch enclosure.
Yes.
So is it actually a 6L?
HRG's opinion is that it's a 6L. The reason it says not surveyed is because under their methodology, a porch enclosure is an automatic discredit. Just like a stuccoed craftsman or an asbestos-sided craftsman, a porch enclosure is a big ding. So because when we said, okay, we're going to look at the pre-19, when we changed the methodology from their first pass to have the priority given to the pre-1918 properties, they looked at it and said, yes, this isn't a 5 because of the porch enclosure, but we will make it a 6L. And partly based on my input, and I hope this is appreciated by the community, we would love to have no 6Ls because they're so hard to deal with. But we have actually encouraged the survey team to add 6Ls, because what that will do is give us more ability to keep the texture, and we mentioned this last time, that the overall look of these properties alive, even if when the day comes that someone says they want to tear it down, we're going to say, we're sorry, it's not historic, you can tear it down. But using our design, because we have design review in Glendale, we can really make 6L work in a way other cities can't make 6L work. So especially for some of these craftsmen, we're looking at it as a good thing, not a bad thing, because we're taking something that they thought should have been a 6Z and making it a 6L.
And then I have one more question. I might be making this up, but at some point in time, did TGHS say that there was some kind of conflict between the context statement and then the actual methodology that's being used?
They're saying that they at one point in history were working off of an early draft of the context. The original context was written in a way that pretty much any old building with decent integrity would qualify. Each context has individual building types, usually by style. Sometimes and then also by typology. And it says it has a list of what are the aspects, the criteria that would allow that property or a property to be designated under that context or the subcontext or the theme. And they, when we looked at that, we realized that's not good enough. And it's similar to what Commissioner Shire mentioned earlier. The word exemplary is very important. We have to have some way to separate the good example from the great example, and not every good example is going to be historically significant to get a 5. So I think that's what they're talking about, but I don't want to speak for them. But the idea that our methodology is stricter than the National Register methodology, which I don't believe that that's true, and I don't believe it is even a point to be made, because we have developed a methodology that's specific to Glendale. And that's why it's very important to hear back from you and from other members of the public. If you think the methodology is wrong, we've got a big problem. We've got to really look at it. I'm very comfortable that this methodology meets all professional practice standards and is very sound. And I'm also comfortable that to the greatest degree possible, HRG is applying it as consistently as you can as we go through hundreds and thousands of properties. So if I'm misinterpreting HRG's comments, I'm sure they'll let us know, and we can talk about it again.
Okay.
I mean TGHS. My brain is so scrambled.
Yes.
So.
Thank you.
And just so I'm clear on this, once the survey is done and these properties have their DPRs completed and everything, would it be fair to say that a property that has a 5S3 designation, would you consider that property to be a historic resource at that point?
It is.
Okay.
It is in our code, and it is by the state under a secret.
Okay. So consider a historic resource.
Anything 5, a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 status code is a historic resource.
Have the owners of the properties,
except in contributing buildings in historic districts in Glendale, but that's another story.
Okay. Okay. So have the property owners, all of these property owners, been notified that a survey is being done?
No. That's never, no city can or does do that.
Okay. So the potential for a homeowner's property to be designated historic is sort of not something that they're necessarily being purposefully made aware of unless they happen to be talking to people and hearing about
Well, not
this.
designated in the sense on the register.
Well, but designated in the
Historic
sense
resource.
designated in the sense that historic preservation now has the jurisdiction over it rather than just building it.
Every survey we've ever done, there are people who have no idea that their house was surveyed, that it was given a status code, and if it's a 5 or higher, they have no idea that it's going to be difficult for them to tear that property down. That's the reality of survey. When we get to city council, this is going to be an issue. I know that as we move forward. It's generally not an issue at the Historic Preservation Commission level because this is standard practice for surveys, and I think we can all agree on that. So,
well, if our comments are going on the record, I'd like to make a comment. Designations like this have the potential to cause big problems for homeowners. They have to disclose information about their property. And as piggybacking on what I asked before, I think we have to be very careful that once this information is decided upon, that one body or another takes responsibility for making sure that this information is very easily accessible in the same way that everything else is. So if they're working on this property portal, making sure this is in the property portal, I think before any of this can be adopted, I think that should be up and running. Homeowners have the potential of serious trouble if they're answering a question on a disclosure form that says, is your home a historic resource? And they say no because they had no idea this was going on. Do they get mailed the DPR at the end?
No.
Okay, so these property owners have no idea that this is happening. And they will
standard practice in all historic surveys all across the country. And in our historic districts, we do mail DPR forms to every property. But in standard surveys, you can imagine Survey LA looked at 880,000 properties, and I'm not sure how many they identified, but let's say it's in the tens of thousands.
So, for instance, in the 2004 North Cumberland Heights survey, in 2004, were the DPR forms mailed to the homeowners? They were.
Our district process is different than a survey like this. The more relevant survey would be the DSP survey, Downtown Specific Plan survey, or the Craftsman survey, which were done according to professional standards, but there was no notification of property owners. In a real estate transaction, a realtor doing due diligence should be checking deeply.
With all due respect, it's actually property owners that are supposed to be doing that, but most of them don't know that they should.
I'm sorry to...
Just so you understand, it's property owners
that...
the property owners are the ones that fill out those disclosures and have to answer those questions. And I will tell you that most realtors don't even know that this type of a situation exists.
But your point is very well taken about making sure the information's available. Since I know we're this close to doing it, it feels to me like it's a push of a button. I'm sure IS will disagree. But they have everything, and they've said it was going to be up a while ago. I'm very comfortable that it will be up once this is done, because this isn't going to be done until first quarter next year. So,
and I'm presuming that a property owner has every right to, just like anybody else in the public, to come before the dais and maybe have an opinion about whether or not their home should be deemed historic. Is that like the Historical Society is coming up and saying, we think these houses should be deemed historic. A property owner, do they have the right? I guess they would have a right if they knew it was going on, right?
The issue, there's a difference between designation and historic resource. Historic resource is a term used by the state or the California Environmental Quality Act to address, properties that are designated and also properties that have been identified as potential resources or potential designated buildings. So if you read the 5S3, which is the code that any 5 property will get in the survey, it says appears eligible for local listing through survey evaluation. That doesn't mean that we are satisfied at that point that it's a historic resource. So say you want to demolish a 5S3 house, we will then ask that a consultant be retained and move forward, and the owner has an opportunity to find a consultant who might find an opinion that disagrees with the survey. But when you have disagreement between experts, most of those properties will be thrust into an EIR process before the demolition can be approved.
Where this has the potential to be an issue is if a property owner wants to make a modification to their home, to the front of their home, that under ordinary circumstances wouldn't necessarily need a permit. If they make that modification without knowing that this 5S3 or even 6L designation is on the property because the information isn't really provided in a progressive manner, it's rather just sort of put out there and it's up to them to know whether or not it exists, that they could then be challenged later because the house is considered a historic resource without them ever really kind of knowing that it was there and that modification that they made needed to go before historic preservation when they didn't necessarily know
you mentioned one thing, work that doesn't require a permit isn't discretionary action. So CEQA does not apply to work that doesn't require a permit.
Okay.
So only work that requires a permit is subject to design review through CEQA.
Okay.
And that's so say a house was given a 5S3, owner has no idea, they come to us and say, we want to stucco our house. We're going to say, unfortunately, your house is identified as a potential resource in our survey. At staff level, I can't approve that, but we would then be able to, if someone was adamant that they had to do it, I guess, this has never come up, but we could take it through further design review to see if the design review authority felt that after that work was done, the house would retain its status as a historic resource. Like I mentioned before, a perfectly intact house, 5S3, comes to us for a window change out, and I'm not saying we're going to approve this, but we could approve it if we felt that the house would retain its 5S3 status after the work was done. So I'm not sure that things would go that way, but that's theoretically how it would work.
Oh.
But the basic question and objection is something, it's a valid concern. Like I said, it usually isn't raised at the Preservation Commission level because this is standard practice. But it's well worth talking about, and I'm sure when we get to council, and I'm sure when other members of the public are more familiar with what we're doing, because right now it's a fairly small group focusing on the survey, those questions may come up. So.
Okay, so back to tonight's objective on, or comments on methodology for 8B. Are there any general comments that people would like to make tonight? Or do you just want to prepare for next month on this topic?
I have no comments
No
tonight.
comments? Okay. Anyone else?
Nope.
Okay, are you okay with that, Jay? And then we'll just...
Yeah, well, at this hour, sure, that's great.
Okay.
So. I'm disappointed, though. I thought you would have comments tonight. But
After we survey the properties more.
But also, please do, acknowledge, the methodology.
Yes.
With bearing in mind that the methodology that was developed is something that we are very satisfied with, and if it was changed significantly, that would throw this into a little disarray. But it's open to comments from both the community and from the commission.
Thank you. Okay, new business, 9A, Miradero Gateway and Brand Family Cemetery in Brand Park, 1601.
Are you awake?
Wake up.
She's hiding back there.
This is for Glendale Register nominations.
Okay.
So staff, do you have a report first you'd like to give?
I guess so. Let's go. Okay, thanks to our former Commissioner Arlene Vidor, we are looking at a single staff report that covers 2 nominations. So we'll have to take 2 votes on these. They'll be assigned 2 separate Glendale Register numbers if they're approved by council ultimately. And this is part of the effort on the part of the commission that was kind of sponsored and driven in large part by Arlene to kind of look at city-owned properties and see which of those were worthy of protection. The idea being if we're extending this wonderful Glendale Register opportunity to private property owners, we should also celebrate our publicly owned buildings. And when the Glendale Register was established, a number of buildings were included from the very beginning, and a few others were added later, including the bridges over the Verdugo Wash, the Miss Green Cross statue, a lot of interesting properties that are city-owned. And then there was a lull where we didn't look at buildings such as Municipal Services Building, which is clearly a Glendale Register and beyond landmark. And we were happy that that was the first one that we took forward through this program, and it's Glendale Register number 100, which we were trying to get a good number for that one. We are now looking at 2 separate entities, 2 separate sites within Brand Park. So we're making it very clear in the nomination that we're looking only at these pieces of Brand Park. We're not designating the park, obviously. Arlene worked with staff here, Bill Ahern, I believe, to develop incredibly detailed property official legal descriptions for these lots, which I can only say I trust are accurate. I'm sure, knowing Bill, they are. But they're the biggest and most complicated I've ever seen for any of our properties. So I'll try to be quick. Both of these sites, the Omerodero Gateway at the foot of the driveway leading up to the Brand Mansion and the Brand Family Cemetery are both within the park, both associated extremely closely with the Brand family, Leslie and Mary Louise, and important parts of the story that's told by the site about their family and about their importance to Glendale, which is pretty much unquestioned. We see on the lower right the mansion, the Brand Library and Arts Center, and its inspiration was the East Indian Pavilion at the Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago. And it's a Saracenic architectural style. It has these very distinctive arches with the kind of scalloped edges. It has the little minaret-like cupola things at the top. And you can see it's a very, clear connection. When Brand first built the house, Miradero Gateway was this rubble stone and wrought iron piece that you saw. That dates to the original construction of the house, as best we understand. In 1913, an addition was made to the house for the tower element that we see on the right when we look at it in the lower picture. At that point, a porte cochere was added, and then the kind of master bedroom in the area above. And the gateway was added at the same time, obviously in the same style. Nathaniel Dryden, who was Brand's brother-in-law, designed the house. We don't know for sure that he designed the gateway, but he was around, and who knows. So, but there's definitely stylistic direct links between them. It's a beautiful feature, still very much in its original condition. The main difference is that the central gate, which was used to be for cars and probably carriages in the early days, is now closed off, and the median was built, and then the two flanking driveways leading up to the library. The pedestrian gates are still open and usable, so you can still walk through the arch. The original ironwork is in place. The Brand initials, the filigree and all of that is still there. In 2011, we brought an item to the commission to install gates across the driveways because there were security concerns in the park. We were very careful to make sure that these gates interacted with the gateway as minimally as possible. So in the lower picture, you can see how they kind of are set back from the back of the gate and then have gates that are running straight into the column. So from the front, you don't really notice them. And that was something that was approved by the commission with some modest design changes to kind of add a few architectural details to bring it a little closer, a little stronger connection with the historic ironwork. And I think that's all we have to say about this. The nomination and staff both agree that it's eligible for its association with the Brand family. It was built during Leslie Brand's lifetime, during his and Mary Louise's occupancy of the house, undoubtedly at his direction. And we also have just the fact that it is such a distinctive and exemplary example of our only Saracenic architecture in Glendale or most places. So pretty obvious connection there. If you want me to present these both, and then you can vote on them separately. The Brand Family Cemetery has a very different connection with Leslie Brand and Mary Louise. It was kind of constructed around the time of Brand's death in 1925. So you see his casket and his body laid out in the parlor of the house. You see it being brought to the site of the cemetery in his beloved Tioga Wolf. You see his burial before the actual monument was built, and then you see a picture of Mrs. Brand at the cemetery. I make some notes in the staff report that when you look at the photo of Mrs. Brand and you look at the current pyramid marker that was built, I believe, sometime shortly after he died. There are changes that I think are attributable to a raise in the grade elevation around it. There are fewer stones visible later than earlier. That's something we're not sure exactly what that history is. So what's kind of remarkable here is, again, we have a very distinctive piece of architectural design through the pyramid. It's not an uncommon kind of burial or grave marker when you go to some old cemeteries around the country. I think it is. I don't think we have any like that at Forest Lawn. I don't want to say it's the only one we have because I just don't know, but it probably is. Its character features are the granite stonework, the shape, the kind of earthen plinth that was built up around it, which seems like that could have been done at a later date, and then the inscriptions and headstones around it, because this isn't only Brand's grave, it's also Mary Louise's grave and many other members of their extended family. The two of them didn't have children, but they had an extended family of nieces and brothers-in-law, sisters, and one interesting feature is Nathaniel Dryden, the architect, being Brand's brother-in-law, is also buried here, and one of the markers is for him. Here's an example of the variety of markers. The burials have been continuing close to the present. Some burials were performed in the 80s. Arlene will talk about one of the last living descendants of the Brands intends to be buried there, and so it's a living cemetery. And one point to make, just in terms of preservation standards, I mentioned in the staff report, but I think it's of interest. The National Register precludes most cemeteries and burial sites from designation on the National Register. The idea being that unless that's the last piece of anything left that recalls the life of whoever is significant that we're talking about, it's not the best thing, because obviously Mr. Brand never saw his monument, never saw the cemetery.
Very true.
It's not associated with his life and the things he did that made him important in Glendale's history. But in Glendale, we don't have any kind of limitation like that, so I think we can make the determination that through the association, not only with Brand, but also perhaps with Nathaniel Dryden, definitely with Brand's wife, that this is significant for its association with people critical in the history of our city, and then because of the very distinctive pyramid form architecturally, I think we can make a finding fairly easily under Criterion 3. That's
Excellent.
everything.
Okay, we'll open the public hearing. Arlene Vidor.
I was going to say a lot of stuff, but I decided to say a lot of stuff.
Sorry.
What's it like being on the other
Long
side?
evening.
It's interesting as always. Well, I'm just going to. The reason I just handed. Thank you very much for considering both of these nominations. I really don't have anything to say about the gates because I think they kind of are self-explanatory, and I'm very glad that the additions that were made and the fact that the walls had to be taken out don't impact, at least according to the staff report, don't impact its eligibility to be landmarked, because it really is a beautiful feature. On the cemetery, I do really just want to give out a huge shout out to Bill Ahern, who is in the building department, and if you ever need to look at what are those maps called, the old Sanborn maps, thank you. If you ever need to look at historic maps or understand historic zoning, he really is a wealth of information, and he's always been very helpful, and he certainly was in this case. I also want to give a big shout to Kathy Billings. I don't know if you drilled in and read the nomination at all, but there's a very big family tree flow diagram in there, and she actually put that together, not the Brand family, so she did a lot of work. And as you may know, Kathy is not the supervisor of Brand Library anymore. She's moved to South Pasadena. So I have let her know that tonight the review is going to take place. And then the third person for whom I just copied out an article from the Brand Associates newsletter is Nancy Thompson Call, Dowie, who is the great-grandniece by marriage to Mr. Brand. She's really related to Mrs. Brand. She's from the Dryden line. But she did spend quite a bit of time right after Mr. Brand died. She spent quite a bit of time at the house with Mrs. Brand and had a very close relationship with her, and she's really an authority on everything. She keeps a lot of great records, and she did give us, and we scanned all of her archives, so those are now available. They haven't been transferred to the City Historic, I don't know what it's called now, the Special Collections Room yet, because I don't think the room is up and running, but there will be a big contribution coming in there. And she's a very wonderful, very intelligent, creative lady, and she was really wanting to be here today, but she couldn't make it. But she did say she would like to come to the City Council meeting. She will be the last person to be buried, and I guess my only concern is you know, she's in very good shape for somebody who's 90, so I don't, see her expiring anytime soon. And when the time comes and the family contacts the city to have her be buried there, I would hate to think that there would be any problem attached to that. So
We'll have to explore the CEQA issues.
well, okay.
Groundwater, I have no idea what it's going to be.
All right. Well, anyway, she was very enthusiastic about this happening, so I think we're all squared away. So read the article, because she has some nice recollections, and that's all I'm going to say. You can go ahead and have your discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for all the work and effort putting it together. Okay, we'll close the public hearing.
Kathy,
Oh, yes, we have a card for someone who's no longer here. Greg Grammer.
Are you the substitute?
I'm the substitute.
Oh,
I can
sure.
submit a card.
Okay.
Thanks. I'm sorry.
So we have
Catherine
Catherine Yurka.
He'd be upset if I didn't come and say something.
No
And just
problem.
on behalf of the Glendale Historical
Don't want to
Society.
upset you.
On behalf of the Glendale Historical Society, I just wanted to say that we endorse wholeheartedly both of these nominations. It's nice to have a tidy package over there at Brand Library. It's such an important building. And we also just want to thank Arlene for her leadership in this and then in general over these many years. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we'll close the public hearing. Comments, discussion among commissioners on the topic?
I think it's a great thing to nominate it. I thank Arlene very, very, very much. I mean, I know the work that goes into this thing, and the fact that you get to meet people from almost the beginning of Glendale is just fascinating in itself. And as a kid, I used to go up there, but it used to be green. Well, I had a friend that lived over on Cleveland, and we used to go up there, and there was a fence around it, but it wasn't. I could, I was about 8, so I could climb over.
This
so it
commissioner
wasn't a big-
disagrees.
I was there. There was no fence.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, when I was there,
Go
there was.
hiking up
There was a
there
fence
and
when I was
past
there.
it.
There used to be Mr. Brand had a hunting lodge up there that burnt years and years and years ago. But we used to go up there and, kind of lay on the pyramid itself.
Yep. It's the same thing.
Very cool. So anyway, thank you very much. It's long overdue on this. So
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
I just want to say, it's such a wonderful read. I mean, it's Commissioner Vartanian can tell you all about Glendale back then and Glendale today. They're a lot alike. So.
No, we've been waiting for this for a long time. Thank you so much, Arlene, for all your work on it. It really was a good read. I enjoyed especially reading the part about when the trust was being resolved or dissolved. And yes. So I do support the nominations, and thank you.
Anyone else?
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all been said. It's great opportunity. Thank you, Arlene.
Thank you. And I concur with the commissioners as well. So with that, we'll need 2 separate motions if we want to start with the Miradero Gateway. And this will be for a Glendale Register nomination only.
Okay, based on the findings identified in the staff determination, I move that the Historic Preservation Commission recommend to the City Council that the Miradero Gateway be designated as a historic resource, each under criteria 2 and 3 in the Glendale Register of Historic Resources.
A second.
Okay.
Commissioner Morgan?
Yes.
Commissioner Vartanian?
Yes.
Commissioner Crignati?
Yes.
Commissioner Doom?
Yes.
Chair Shire?
Yes.
Passes 5-0.
Excellent.
We'll move on to City Council.
Okay, so then we need a motion separate for Brand Family Cemetery.
I move that the Historic Preservation Commission recommend to the City Council that the Brand Family Cemetery be designated as a historic resource under criterion 2 and 3 in the Glendale Register of Historic Resources.
Second.
Second. Oh, okay.
Who gets that one?
You can give it
Give
to
it to
Nick.
Duke.
Okay.
Give it to the new guy.
New guy gets it. Roll call. Commissioner Doom?
Yes.
Commissioner Crignati?
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan?
To quote Catherine Yerka, wholeheartedly I endorse it. So, yes.
Okay. Commissioner Vartanian?
Yes.
And Chair Shire?
Yes.
Very good. Passes.
Excellent. Okay, we're moving on to item 10 on the agenda, the Planning Division updates and informational briefings. And 10A is a briefing on the Glendale Register of Historic Resources eligibility on Criterion 5.
Yes, it is. This was a request from the Commission after some discussions at previous hearings about Criterion 5. Oops, there we go. I'll just be very brief on this. When we proposed changes to the Historic Preservation Ordinance, which is section or chapter 1520 of the Municipal Code, we made many changes. We changed definitions. We made it a much more specific document. We brought on the possibility that City Council could designate property over an owner's objection, which did make it through City Council with some controversy. Among the things we did was clean up the criteria for designation. Previously we had 7. Some of those were a little wonky. I proposed bringing it into accordance with the federal standards that are used by all states also, which is kind of the standard 4 that we're familiar with: association with events, association with people, architectural importance, and archaeological importance. We added a 5th criterion specifically because of a case that we were working on where we recognized that a property owner had come to us and said, I'd like to put some houses on the Glendale Register that were part of a larger development. And it was a group of 3 craftsman houses. And the craftsman houses were unexceptional examples. And at that point, even at that point, I didn't think that we could make findings that those would be eligible for the Glendale Register. There were some other issues, but ultimately we recognized that there was value in finding ways to incentivize designations so that Mills Act contracts could be offered to property owners who had houses or properties that very nice, like a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight, but not quite making any of the 4 traditional criteria findings. And we consulted with the State Historic Preservation Office. We consulted with the City Attorney's Office. We brought it to the Historic Preservation Commission twice, and then in terms of the whole review of the entire ordinance change. And then it also went to City Council for introduction, and then went through a lengthy discussion at the vote, which is the second hearing for an ordinance change. I'll read what we wrote in the staff report that went to City Council. That was I think it was exactly the same that went to Council relating to this. We suggested, this was when we were proposing it, the 5th criterion is proposed to give the Commission flexibility in recognizing the contribution that early vernacular structures make to the city's neighborhoods. Many of these may not meet the highest standards called for by the other criteria, but may still be rare reflections of Glendale's early heritage. By potentially allowing such structures to be designated, this criterion could provide owners with an incentive through the Mills Act program to retain buildings that would otherwise be destroyed. So we've been, at staff level, we've been treating this as what we call the incentive criterion. It would typically, the expectation was that it would typically be applied when none of the other 4 were found to be applicable to the site. The idea was, thinking with the craftsmen and thinking about this specific project, the possibility of designating an intact, probably high integrity, say 6L structure, 6L type structure if it hadn't been surveyed, allowing a developer or a property owner to perhaps build 1 or 2 units or whatever the zoning would allow on the lot, so they could increase the density on the lot and increase their the profit potential of the lot, but then commit to saving the house, which we generally think of as would be the front house rather than the back house, and build on the site. And through the incentive of the Mills Act, we thought maybe there will be people interested in this. It turns out that the case that we kind of got this rolling, they made alterations to the properties that rendered them ineligible for the Glendale Register, and this was reviewed by the commission, and that determination was made, which was unfortunate, but Criterion 5 still exists as this incentive criterion. When it was being discussed at commission level, I acknowledge that there could be more flexibility. It could be something that we develop policy around over time. I've been fairly adamant that it's unnecessary to use for most of our nominations. Pretty much all of our nominations meet criterion 1, 2, or 3 generally, 1 or more of those. And I've been trying very hard to keep the policy that this is, the incentive criterion. So I'm not sure where to take this report other than to say that's still staff's belief and expectation unless we receive other guidance, because this is a policy decision and the commission can contribute to kind of interpretations of the code. And we have a list of policies like our naming policy that we've developed that aren't codified, they're just commission policies. But I can't think of any situation where a property would need to have this designation. I think it's because it was purposefully written rather vaguely, rather broadly, and that was the advice we got from SHPO. Anyone reading the criterion as currently found in the code would say, sure, that applies, because, yeah, it's an old house. It reflects the early heritage of Glendale. What I would prefer is that we use it as this incentive criterion and think of it that way. In a future code amendment, if the commission agrees, we could make that more clear. Right now, it's definitely not clear, and I acknowledge that. So I'm not sure if you need anything else to think about, but since this has come up a few times where I'm coming up and saying, well, it's the incentive criterion, it doesn't really apply. If the commission also does think we should be using it more, I would need a little bit of guidance in terms of advising people, what does it mean? Because of the broad language that we chose.
So should we initiate a code revision just to clarify that, or are you sort of going to have it in the file until there are more revisions being made?
Code revisions we were only allowed to do a couple of times a year, and with both the zoning code and other codes or other chapters of the code, we build things up. We just keep a list of what we want to change, and then the next time we make a revision recommendation, we would add this. If the commission believes that it was your understanding from the time that you heard this, and I know several of you weren't around for this, if you think, yes, maybe we should keep this as an incentive criterion, we can make a policy determination that I would write up similar to the naming conventions that we have, and it would just go into your books, into our records, and we would all kind of know. And then hopefully at the next revision, it's going to get codified. If you think that we should use it more loosely, the only concern I have is what if a property came to us that someone said was only eligible under that criterion without the intention of doing the restoration work that the Mills Act would lead to. So, and there are checks and balances to prevent that, because you wouldn't necessarily approve a register nomination for that property
without conditions and all.
Without the stick of the Mills Act. So there are 2 or more options for you to consider.
Have any 5s ever gone through, been sent to council? Only on 5?
Not individually. I think we've been a little. I myself there's a house on Kenneth Road. It's the old farmhouse that has the double porch in the front and the columns, kind of an early property. I think we kind of just let that slip through as because it was also clearly eligible as a 3. I think it may have been included as a 5. that's the kind of thing I'd rather not do unless, it's not, that wasn't the intention of developing the 5. And I think that was just a lax moment.
And I think the only other time it came up was recently regarding the Casa Verdugo nomination. So we're probably not going to have it come up that often. But
Yeah, and where Casa Verdugo was clearly eligible under 1, 2, and
So
3,
many,
it didn't really
yeah.
need the 5. It just was another, what's it called? Feather in your cap.
Yeah, a boost.
so I don't know how you all feel. Should we, or if it's a lot of work for you, should we at least have our books updated so we have it somewhere? Or
Well, if that's your decision, one way or the other, we can make it the policy so we have it written down at least.
Yes.
That's
Right
probably
now.
that would be good to have something to
idea.
point to.
Okay. And would you want it to be the more restrictive, let's keep it as the incentive criterion? Theoretically, a property would only be nominated under criterion 5, and then you'd have to review whether you thought it was worthy of designation, and then what Mills Act conditions would have to be applied, if any.
Yes.
And I'm not sure there is the reason we thought this is it's another opportunity to give a financial incentive to property owners, and it's one that didn't exist before we created this. But as I said, no one's taken us up on it. But every single time we have this situation, it's raised with the owners at least. We just haven't had any takers yet. So. Okay, so your direction is to keep it as an incentive criterion,
Yes.
develop policy language to go into your handbooks, and then put it on our list for future code amendments.
Perfect.
Okay. And I guess we should have a vote on that since it is commission policy.
Okay.
Actually, well, I put it in as a briefing.
Maybe we have to agendize it.
Since we don't have an attorney sitting in the house, I'll just. So I will. Let's just have a vote just in case. I don't think it can hurt. So is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Greg? Chris? Sorry.
It's okay. Always happens.
I know.
Not just from you.
I hope not.
No.
Second.
Okay. Okay, so the motion is to keep criterion 5 as an incentive criterion, update the board's policy manual, and future update to the code. Commissioner Vartanian?
Yes.
Commissioner Crignati?
Yes.
Commissioner Doom?
Yes.
Commissioner Morgan?
Yes.
Chair Shire?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so 10B. Did we talk about this earlier?
I think we're done.
Yeah, I think we are. I have no speaker card.
Why don't you submit that to the chair?
I've been a little quicker.
All right, so 10B, update on supplementary information provided by the Glendale Historic Society relating to its review of the preliminary draft of the South Glendale Historic Resources Survey. And under that, I will open the public hearing. We have one speaker card. Kathy Yerka.
Thank you. So I'm going to get to my comments on this issue in a slightly roundabout way, but they won't take too long. First of all, you have copies of all the photographs that we took. You don't have to rely on the little thumbnails. We sent these via Dropbox or WeTransfer, I can't remember. So if you need them again, just let me know.
Did you send those to the commissioners?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And I do want to say to Jay that we are really glad to have had the survey in advance of when it was released publicly. I don't know what we would have done, where we would be now if we had seen it for the first time a month ago. But I also want to point out that that's not what Francesca is saying when she's talking about the public process. As she said a few times in her remarks, that the public input is considered most crucial before reviewing the results, before the decisions have been made. And I know that not all of the decisions have been made. We're going to argue about, properties here and there, but the crucial decision has been made. And that decision was the methodology. And it was made with zero public input and comment. And it was made with zero input from the Historic Preservation Commission. And I don't understand how that is possible. I'm not even sure you have seen the methodology statement because it is not included in full in the HRG survey report that was produced for the last staff meeting. I have a fuller version where, because it's very generic, it just says, oh, we looked at this and we looked at that. It doesn't really, I believe, contain the kind of details, what's excluded, what's included. So you do need to make sure you get a copy of that. Also, regarding the registration requirements, these are sort of what lay out the kind of, ideas about what an eligible historic resource would have to look at. Those were discussed, I believe, by the HPC in August 2014 as part of the historic resources draft. Sorry, the historic resource context statement.
Yes.
The draft. In September 2014, those registration requirements were totally rewritten. And they are completely different. And I don't know that you've ever seen those or that was brought to your attention. We only learned about it when we were referring to the August 2014 registration requirements and were told, those don't exist. These are the actual registration requirements. We're like, where did those come from? And then by doing, our handy Google search, we found the document from 1 month later. So you might want to look at those too. The difference between the registration requirements that you received and the ones that were changed 30 days later. Staff has said, Mr. Platt or Jay has said repeatedly that he's really comfortable and really comfortable with the methodology and proud of the methodology. But then why wasn't it given to you and to us to review? We're not comfortable with it. We're not comfortable with the content of it. We're not comfortable with the process, and we're not comfortable with the results. And I'd like you to ask yourselves, if you'd been told that the methodology would prevent any house, no matter how early it was built, from being a historic resource because it had an enclosed porch, no matter how early that work was done, would you have been okay with that? I'm inclined to think not. That's an example from 137 South Jackson, to pull one out. It's a house from 1908. It has an enclosed porch. You can see the original windows through that porch. That we proposed it as 5S3. HRG settled on 6L, enclosed porch. Or composite siding. If the only change to a house is the composite siding, would you have been willing to say, okay, that cannot be a historic resource? I don't have the reference here, but there's a lovely house, I think, that we showed in our presentation. The only visible change is composite siding. It has very elegant features apart from that. I don't think you would have supported that. Remember, this is not about what's eligible for the Mills Act. That's different. This is what's eligible for the Glendale Register. So the registration requirements, both the August 2014 and the September 2014 version say, a version of this, more alterations may be permissible on properties before 1918 because they're rarer. Only in this, and that's where the methodology and the registration requirements conflict. Only in the secret methodology were the constraints laid out. Oh, no enclosed porches. That automatically knocks you off. And that's why we're so frustrated. We're really glad that we had the opportunity to spend hundreds of hours reviewing the survey and walking the streets of Glendale. But we can't help but thinking maybe if we'd spent 2 hours reviewing the methodology with all of you in a public hearing where we could have commented, that wouldn't have been necessary. I did want to make a comment too, and I've only looked at about 8 of the properties in the thing that Jay gave me, the list of HRG's responses to our suggestions. And I just wanted to make a general point. I just looked at one that's 407 Naranja. It's a lovely 1922 two-story craftsman. It's a very different kind of a craftsman. Their justification for having it as 6Z is that the Sanborn map shows that it's been altered. My guess is that's a Sanborn map from 1925. And, that doesn't tell us anything. I mean, as Francesca was pointing out, it's not simply one date that matters, that we don't know when that was altered. And I will point out that the Craftsman Survey, the city-adopted Craftsman Survey, stated explicitly that alterations made within 20 years of the date of construction need not be seen as compromising the integrity of the structure, meaning it does not necessarily disqualify it from being found to be a historic resource. That's not to say that it won't disqualify it, but it doesn't need to, and that's why that Sanborn map thing. I mean, it's just insufficient. It's not useful information. The last thing I just wanted to point out, and Jay, this is information you can pass on to HRG, is among the 8 properties I looked at that I knew we had requested, 3 are missing. And those are 3, sorry.
Among the 8?
Oh, I just went through some addresses. So 3 are missing.
3 are missing from the address range of the 8
no,
you looked at?
3 specific properties are missing from the ones that I looked at in the document you gave me. I just want to tell you what they are. You don't need to worry.
I'm just confused by what you're saying.
I looked for 3 properties listed on Roads End. They're not on it.
Right, okay, so you looked at 8? You looked at all of the R's for Roads End.
No, sorry. I just looked around.
Okay.
So I was like, the enclosed porch, this. 3 properties that I looked at on Roads End because I thought they might be missing because we thought that they had considered things non-contributors to historic districts that should be contributors. We gave them that information, but we did it on the historic districts.
Right, I don't think this includes the historic districts.
But it doesn't include, it does, okay, but those
I can't speak to that. I got this yesterday.
Okay, sure.
I haven't,
But my guess is that even though I said in the email, please check the historic district page for our suggestions. I think they might not have done it.
That seems.
So I just wanted to let you know. So
I'm
you
sure
could
they're being methodical. I'm sure they'll take care of it.
So I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll close the public hearing. Okay, is there any discussion on 10B? Or do you want to?
I have none at this
Jay,
time.
did you want to comment at all, or do we
No,
move
unless
on?
you have questions.
Okay, thank you for your feedback. We'll go to 10C, updates on 1106 Ross Moyne Mills Act application and 1753 Hillcrest Mills Act fulfillment.
Okay, let me 10C. Just to be formal. There we go. So these are 2 properties we looked at last month. These are Mills Act laggards that I've taken the blame for their laggardness in both cases to some degree. 1106 Ross Moyne, I put a call in to the owner. You had given him a deadline to come back to give us information at this hearing whether or not he intended to move forward with the stucco change out and the any other of the Mills Act conditions. I haven't heard back from him. So that is your update. If you direct me to ask him to come to a hearing, to appear before you, if you want me to try for another month, I'll do whatever you suggest.
So his is just an application, right?
He's actually on the Glendale Register. It's a difficult one.
So you missed last month, right?
Yes.
Maybe give them a quick summary
Okay,
of
so
what.
this house was nominated by its previous owner for the Register and for the Glendale Register. I'm sorry, and the Mills Act. It came to the commission. The commission approved it with a series of conditions. The biggest of which is the stucco texture on this house is really rough and inappropriate texture. The condition was to change the stucco, which is a big job. There was also a condition to change the garage door, change some ironwork on a rear patio or a rear balcony railing, a couple of other things, 1 or 2 other things. Those owners decided that they did not want to move forward with the Mills Act, and so the house, they did not, or I'm sorry, they went to council. Council approved the Register designation and the Mills Act. Then they decided that they did not want to sign the Mills Act contract. They did not want to go forward with what the commission recommended, probably because at that point what we didn't know was they were selling the house, but then they did sell the house. So current owner inherits a Glendale Register property that needs to have these Mills Act conditions fulfilled in order for it to truly be eligible for the Glendale Register. And there's been a significant multi-year time lag between that purchase and today. So the options we've extended, and the new owner has said, I'm interested. I want the Mills Act. I like the register. I want my house to be there, but just hasn't acted on it. Options are to give the person a little more time to come back and say, partly, and I acknowledge, I wasn't on him every month or every even 6 months to do something.
You should take that interest.
I know, but there's. Thank you. I'll just take what I can get. No, you're. So but he has expressed what I believe is a sincere interest in moving forward. He did say he was having trouble getting contractors to return calls. That seems to be a very common problem lately for a lot of people. I don't know what the story is. I think the commission's options would be to grant another month, for example, to really, and I'll call him Monday and say, listen, this is it. Originally, we were going to just withdraw this from the Glendale Register. Our city attorney at that time, because that was right after all this happened, he said, let's try to, it'll be neater to keep it moving forward. But at this point, we have to make that decision. So,
Knowing we're going to, if I may, we're going to combine the next 2 months' meetings with a full agenda, and knowing the holiday, probably more difficult to get a contractor then too. Would you want to press them to the end of the year or give them until January?
it's a commission's call, but that's a good point.
Because we're waiting on final decision on intent, right, to move forward is basically
Right.
the answer we need.
Yeah, I think what he's looking for, he still doesn't have a sense of how much money this is really going to be. And the decision, I assume, will be based on that. So
I think that sounds
moving
fair.
to the January hearing?
That sounds fair.
Give them till January. Then you're not rushed to find them too. And
What was the date? January 18th?
January 18th.
Yeah, 18th, 18.
He has plenty of time.
Okay,
So then I guess, so then if he doesn't respond again, what, we would just pull him from the register?
Yeah, which is a process. We have a process for deletion from the register.
Yeah.
So we'll bring it to the commission. We have to publicly notice it, which we don't have to do for our Glendale Register nominations, which isn't that big of a deal. But
a lot of work.
Does the house stay good in registered terms but not Mills Act terms?
No, the stucco alone would
Prevent it from being even on the register?
Yeah.
Okay.
The ironwork maybe not, the garage door maybe not, but the stucco definitely. So.
Sounds good.
All right, so we have a resolution there. And then our update on the house at 1753 Hillcrest, where we have the metal carport. The owners are taking this very seriously. They're moving forward. They are aware of our deadlines. The staff person who's working on this is on it.
Good.
So this one's going well.
Great.
Good.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And with no more agenda items, we will adjourn the meeting at 8:47.
Hold on. One more item.
What?
Thank you.
The Dodgers are returning to the World